Imagine every atom watching itself, every photon aware of its dance. What if the universe isn't a machine, but a mind dreaming in light and gravity? The illusion of separateness fades when you realize that the energy flowing through your thoughts is the same that births galaxies. You're not a fragment looking up at the stars. You are the awareness through which stars know they shine. This is not philosophy, it's remembrance. For consciousness is not in you, you are in it. I stand at my bedroom window, 3 in the morning, watching the cosmos sprawl across the darkness like scattered diamonds on black velvet. The city sleeps below, its electric veins pulsing with the dreams of 8 million souls, each one convinced they are separate, isolated islands of consciousness floating in an indifferent sea of matter. But tonight, something feels different. Tonight, the distance between myself and those distant stars seems both infinite and impossibly intimate. My reflection stares back from the glass. Tired eyes, greying temples, the accumulated weight of 43 years of seeking answers that always seem to slip away just as I think I've grasped them. Behind my reflection, the Milky Way spirals in its ancient dance, carrying our small blue world through the void at speeds that render all human urgency absurd. How did I get here? Not just to this window, this moment, but to this peculiar state of being, a conscious observer trapped in a universe that science tells me is fundamentally unconscious, yet somehow gave rise to my very awareness of it. The paradox has haunted me since childhood. When I first learned that the stars I wished upon were nuclear furnaces burning across impossible distances, their light travelling for years just to reach my retina. I remember being 7 years old, lying on my back in my grandmother's garden, overwhelmed by the realization that the same carbon atoms in my body were forged in the hearts of dying stars. Even then, I sensed something profound in this connection. But what? The textbook spoke of physics and chemistry, of random collisions and emergent complexity. Yet beneath their explanations lurked something that felt more like poetry than science. "You're made of star stuff," Carl Sagan had said, and the phrase lodged itself in my chest like a splinter of light. But if I am star stuff and stars are made of the same quantum fields that supposedly give rise to consciousness, then what exactly is the difference between the observer and the observed? This question has been my constant companion through 2 decades of searching. I've studied neuroscience, hoping to find consciousness hiding in the firing of neurons. I've delved into quantum mechanics, wondering if awareness might emerge from the strange probabilistic dance of particles. I've sat in meditation halls and walked forest paths, seeking the direct experience that might transcend intellectual understanding. Yet here I am, still, standing at the edge of the known, feeling the weight of my own awareness like a mystery I carry but cannot solve. The universe stretches before me in all directions, 13 billion years of cosmic evolution, 100 billion galaxies, each containing hundreds of billions of stars. The numbers are so vast they lose all meaning, becoming mere abstractions that point towards something the human mind cannot truly comprehend. Yet somehow this incomprehensible vastness has arranged itself in such a way that I, a temporary pattern of absibin of atoms and energy, can stand here and contemplate its existence. Science tells me I am an accident, a random fluctuation in the quantum foam that happened to achieve self-awareness through billions of years of blind evolution. But if that's true, why does my awareness feel so much like coming home? Why do I sense in moments like this that consciousness is not something that emerged from the universe, but something the universe is? The stars offer no answers tonight, only their ancient light and the patient reminder that I am part of something far larger than my individual existence. Yet their silence is pregnant with possibility. In the space between question and answer, between the known and the unknowable, something is stirring. I think of the mystics who spoke of unity, of the direct realization that all separation is illusion. I think of the physicists who discovered that matter is mostly empty space, that particles exist in superposition until observed that entangled quantum systems remain mysteriously connected across any distance. Both groups point toward the same impossible conclusion, that the boundaries we take for granted, between self and other, between mind and matter, between observer and observed, may be nothing more than conceptual constructs overlaid upon a reality that is fundamentally whole. But how does one bridge the gap between intellectual understanding and direct realization? How does one move from thinking about unity to experiencing it? The spiritual traditions speak of grace, of surrender, of letting go of the very self that seeks to understand. The scientific method demands rigor, evidence, reproducible results. They seem to pull in opposite directions, yet both arise from the same human impulse to know what is true. Standing here in the pre-dawn darkness, I feel myself balanced on the razor's edge between these two ways of knowing. Behind me lies the familiar world of subject and object, of thoughts and the thinker, of the separate self navigating over a world of separate things. Ahead lies something I can sense but not yet name, a territory where the very foundations of identity begin to dissolve. The city below is waking now. I can see the first lights flickering on in distant windows, each one representing another conscious being beginning another day of experience. Each person will wake believing they are a separate self, contained within the boundaries of their skin, looking out at the world that exists independently of their perception of it. But what if we have it backwards? What if consciousness is not something that happens inside our heads, but something our heads happen inside of? What if the universe is not a collection of separate objects being observed by separate subjects, but a single field of awareness experiencing itself through countless points of view? The question hangs in the air like morning mist, neither fully formed nor easily dismissed. And in the asking, something begins to shift, not just in my understanding, but in the very fabric of what I take to be myself. The coffee shop hums with the Monday morning ritual of caffeine and connection. I sit in my usual corner booth, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of clinking cups, whispered conversations, and the soft tap of fingers on keyboards. Everyone here believes they are contained within their skin, separate minds navigating a world of solid objects. But after last night's encounter with the stars, their certainty feels like a collective dream from which we have yet to awaken. Sarah Chen arrives precisely at 8:15, her physicist's punctuality as reliable as atomic decay. We've been having these conversations for months now, a neuroscientist and a quantum physicist grappling with the hard problem of consciousness like two blindfolded people trying to describe an elephant. She slides into the booth across from me, her coffee already in hand, her expression carrying that particular mixture of excitement and frustration that comes with dancing at the edge of the impossible. I've been thinking about our last conversation, she says without preamble, about whether consciousness emerges from matter or whether matter emerges from consciousness. I think we've been asking the wrong question entirely. I lean forward, recognizing the tone. This is how breakthroughs announce themselves, not with grand proclamations, but with the quiet suggestion that we've been looking at the problem upside down. What do you mean? She pulls out her tablet and begins sketching. We keep trying to reduce one to the other. Either consciousness is produced by brain states, or brain states are produced by consciousness. But what if they're both expressions of something more fundamental? Her drawing takes shape, a circle with two overlapping regions, like a Venn diagram. Classical physics taught us to see the world as made of discrete objects, particles with definite positions and properties existing independently of observation. But quantum mechanics shattered that picture. At the most fundamental level, reality consists of quantum fields, probability waves that only collapse into definite states when measured. I know where this is heading, but I let her develop the thought. Sometimes the familiar needs to be rediscovered from a new angle. Here's what's been keeping me awake, she continues, her pen moving in quick, precise strokes. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics. We know that observation causes wave function collapse, but we've never been able to explain how or why. We just accept it as a brute fact. But what if it's not observation by conscious beings that causes collapse? What if consciousness is the field that underlies all quantum events? The words hang between us like a bridge I'm not sure I'm ready to cross. You're suggesting consciousness is fundamental? Not emergent from complex brain activity, but basic to the fabric of reality itself. I'm suggesting it might be the only thing that's truly fundamental. She leans back, her eyes bright with the particular madness that seizes scientists when they glimpse something that might change everything. Think about it. Every theory of quantum mechanics, from Copenhagen to many worlds to cubism, struggles with the same problem. How do we account for the subjective experience of measurement? But what if we have it backwards? What if subjective experience is what makes measurement possible in the first place? I sip my coffee, letting the idea percolate. Around us, the coffee shop continues its morning symphony of separate selves pursuing separate agendas. Yet if Sarah is right, beneath this apparent multiplicity lies a deeper unity, a field of consciousness that accesses itself through every quantum interaction, every collapsed wave function, every moment of awareness. But how do we test such a hypothesis, I ask? How do we move from speculation to science? Maybe we can't, she admits. Not in the traditional sense. Consciousness can't be observed as an object because it's the prerequisite for all observation. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror, but there might be another way to approach it. She flips to a new page and begins sketching what looks like a wave pattern. Information theory. Claude Shannon showed us that information is not just about data, it's about the physical capacity to distinguish between different states, and quantum mechanics tells us that information is conserved, that it can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed. So consciousness might be information processing at its most fundamental level, not information about something, but the very capacity for there to be an about at all. The distinction between subject and object, between knower and known, might be the most basic form of information in the universe. The implications begin to cascade through my mind like dominoes falling in slow motion. If consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, then every particle interaction involves some form of experience, however primitive. If information is conserved, then the patterns of consciousness that constitute my sense of self are as eternal as energy itself, constantly transforming but never truly destroyed. You realize what you're proposing, I say slowly. You're suggesting that the whole materialist worldview, the idea that consciousness is produced by brain activity, might be backwards, that instead of brains creating minds, minds create the appearance of brains. Not exactly, she says, her precision as a scientist asserting itself. I'm suggesting that both mind and brain are manifestations of something more fundamental. Like wave and particle in quantum mechanics, there are complementary descriptions of the same underlying reality. A memory surfaces from my meditation practice, moments when the sense of being a separate self simply vanished, leaving only pure awareness, vast and borderless. In those moments, there was no brain producing consciousness and no consciousness observing a brain. There was simply knowing itself, aware and present without a knower. Have you ever experienced that directly, I ask? Not as a theory, but as a lived reality? She pauses, and for a moment her scientific reserve softens. Once, during my PhD, I was working 18-hour days running experiments on quantum entanglement. I was so exhausted I could barely think straight. I was staring at the data from our latest run, 2 photons that had been entangled and then separated by several meters, when something shifted. Suddenly I wasn't Sarah looking at data about photons. I was the field in which photons and Sarah and data were all arising. The separation between observer and observed just dissolved. How long did it last? Maybe 30 seconds, but it changed everything. Not my understanding, my experience. Before that moment, I was a conscious being studying quantum mechanics. After it, I was quantum mechanics becoming conscious of itself through the form called Sarah. The coffee shop noise fades into background as we sit in the silence that follows profound recognition. We are 2 waves in an ocean, temporarily convinced of our separateness, discovering that the water we are made of is the same water that contains us. The question, Sarah says finally, is whether such experiences are just interesting brain states or whether they're glimpses of how reality actually is. And how do we find out? She smiles, and in her expression I see the same restless seeking that has driven me to this moment. We keep asking questions, we keep looking, and maybe, if we're very lucky, we stop being the ones who are looking and become the looking itself. Outside, the city continues its dance of separate selves pursuing separate dreams. But in this small booth, over coffee and conversation, the boundaries have begun to blur, not just between Sarah and me, but between the very concepts of separate and together, between the questioner and the question, between the universe studying itself and the study itself. Something is beginning to emerge from the space between, or perhaps something that was always there is beginning to remember itself. The laboratory feels like a cathedral at midnight, all humming computers and quietly blinking lights performing their electronic vespers. Dr. Chen has arranged for me to observe tonight's experiment, a test of quantum entanglement that will separate two photons by nearly a kilometre while maintaining their mysterious connection. As I watch the technicians make their final preparations, I can't shake the feeling that we're about to witness something that will change not just our understanding of physics, but our understanding of what it means to be. The setup is elegant in its simplicity, Sarah explains, guiding me through the maze of laser tables and beam splitters. We create a pair of entangled photons here in the lab, then send one through fibre optic cables to our detector array on the other side of campus. According to quantum mechanics, measuring one photon should instantaneously affect the state of its partner, regardless of the distance between them. The implications still make my mind reel. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance and spent years trying to prove it couldn't be real. But experiment after experiment has confirmed what seems impossible. Particles that have interacted remain connected across any distance, their states correlated in ways that transcend our ordinary understanding of space and time. It's not communication in the usual sense, Sarah continues, adjusting a mirror with micrometer precision. No information travels from one photon to the other. It's more like they were never really separate to begin with. The entangled state exists as a whole, with the individual particles being more like facets of a single quantum reality. A technician gives the thumbs up. The experiment is ready to begin. As the laser fires and the detection equipment springs to life, I find myself thinking about a conversation I had 3 weeks ago with my daughter Emma, home from college for spring break. She had been struggling with depression, feeling isolated and disconnected from her friends, her studies, even from me. We sat on the back porch as the sun set, and she tried to explain the weight of separation she carried. "It's like I'm trapped inside my own head," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone else seems so far away, like I'm watching life through glass. Even when I'm surrounded by people, I feel completely alone." I wanted to comfort her, to bridge the gap she felt so acutely. But how do you explain to someone who feels utterly isolated that separation might be the deepest illusion? How do you convey that the very awareness that feels so private and contained might be the thread that connects all things? "The first measurements are coming in," Sarah announces, pulling me back to the present. Data streams across the monitors in real time, columns of numbers that represent the quantum states of particles separated by nearly 1,000 meters. But the numbers tell only part of the story. What they can't capture is the sheer strangeness of what they represent. Two particles behaving as one system, their fates intertwined in ways that seem to mock our ordinary understanding of identity and independence. "Look at this correlation," Sarah says, pointing to a graph that shows the measurement results. Perfect anti-correlation. When we measure one photon in a vertical polarization state, its partner is always measured in horizontal polarization. Not sometimes, always, as if they're two sides of the same coin, even though they're separated by more distance than light can travel in the time between measurements. I watch the data accumulate, each measurement adding to the statistical certainty that something impossible is routinely occurring. But the impossibility feels less shocking now than it did when I first encountered it in textbooks. Perhaps the mind, when sufficiently prepared, can stretch to accommodate truths that seemed absurd from a more limited perspective. "What does this tell us about consciousness?" I ask. Sarah pauses the data collection and turns to face me. "That's the question that's been haunting me. If particles that have never met can remain connected across arbitrary distances, what does that say about conscious beings who have interacted? What does it say about the nature of awareness itself?" The question hangs in the air like incense. In the silence that follows, I become acutely aware of my own consciousness, the strange, ineffable fact of being aware. But now, instead of feeling like something contained within the boundaries of my skull, it feels more like a local intensification of something vast and distributed, like a wave on an ocean that temporarily believes it is separate from the water that forms it. "I had an experience last week," I find myself saying, surprising myself with the admission. I was meditating, and for a moment the sense of being a separate self just vanished. There was still awareness, but no one who was aware. It was like consciousness recognizing itself as the field in which all experience arises. Sarah nods slowly. The mystics have been saying this for thousands of years. That individual consciousness is like a wave thinking it's separate from the ocean. But what if quantum entanglement is showing us the same thing from a scientific perspective? What if the correlations we measure between particles are just the tip of the iceberg, visible evidence of a deeper unity that underlies all apparent separation? The data collection resumes, and we watch in comfortable silence as the impossible becomes routine. Measurement after measurement confirms what seems to violate everything we think we know about locality and independence. Yet here it is, as reliable as sunrise, as predictable as the tides. My phone buzzes with a text from Emma. "Dad, the strangest thing just happened. I was sitting in my dorm room feeling that usual disconnection when suddenly I felt connected. Not to anything specific, just connected. Like I remembered that I was never actually separate from anything. It only lasted a few moments, but I wanted to share it with you. Love you." I stare at the message, and something shifts in my chest. Here, in this laboratory, we're documenting the mysterious connections between particles. Meanwhile, my daughter, 800 miles away, experiences a sudden sense of connection at almost exactly the same moment I'm contemplating the nature of unity. Coincidence? Or another echo of the entanglement that weaves through all things? "You look like you've seen a ghost," Sarah observes. "Maybe I have. Or maybe I'm beginning to see that the ghost and the seer are the same thing." She stops the experiment, and we watch the final data points populate the screen. Thousands of measurements, each one a confirmation that reality is far stranger and more interconnected than our everyday experience suggests. But the strangeness no longer feels alienating. Instead, it feels like coming home to a truth that was always present but temporarily forgotten. "The ancient Hindu texts speak of Indra's net," I say, thinking aloud. "An infinite web of jewels, each one reflecting all the others. They say it represents the interconnectedness of all existence, that each individual being contains the whole universe, and the whole universe is contained in each individual being. Quantum entanglement as spiritual metaphor," Sarah muses, "or perhaps spiritual insight as quantum physics. The language is different, but they might be pointing to the same underlying reality." We begin shutting down the equipment, but the experiment continues in my awareness. The entangled photons have returned to the quantum foam from which they emerged, but the questions they've raised persist. If particles can remain connected across any distance, what does this say about the nature of connection itself? If measurement reveals correlations that seem to transcend space and time, what does this suggest about the nature of the measurer? Walking across campus under the star-filled sky, I think again of Emma's text. The synchronicity might be meaningless, a random convergence in a universe full of random convergences. But what if synchronicity itself is evidence of the deeper pattern, the underlying entanglement that connects all conscious beings in ways we're only beginning to understand? The laboratory fades behind me, but the questions it has raised illuminate the path ahead. Somewhere between the mystical insight and the scientific measurement, between the ancient wisdom and the quantum revelation, a new understanding is beginning to emerge. Not quite science and not quite spirituality, but something that transcends both by including both. The stars above continue their ancient dance, and for a moment I feel myself dancing with them. Not as a separate observer watching from below, but as a temporary focal point of the same cosmic awareness that spins galaxies and splits photons and reads text messages from daughters who remember, if only briefly, that they were never actually separate from anything at all. The sleep lab looks like something from a science fiction film, a room within a room, walls lined with copper mesh to block electromagnetic interference, the air humming with the quiet electricity of sophisticated monitoring equipment. Dr. Maria Santos, the researcher leading this study on consciousness during sleep, has invited me to observe as they map the brain activity of lucid dreamers, people who become aware they are dreaming while still asleep. What we're exploring tonight challenges the traditional boundaries between waking and sleeping consciousness, she explains as technicians attach electrodes to the scalp of tonight's volunteer, a woman named Janet who's been lucid dreaming since childhood. If consciousness is truly fundamental rather than simply an emergent property of brain activity, then we should find evidence of awareness operating according to different rules during the dream state. I watch the monitors come alive with the neural symphony of a mind preparing for sleep, waves of electrical activity that will soon carry Janet into landscapes that exist nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The parallels to quantum mechanics are hard to ignore. Both involve states that seem to violate our ordinary understanding of reality. Both require a kind of observation that changes the very thing being observed. The interesting question, Dr. Santos continues, is what happens to the observer during dreams. In waking consciousness, we typically experience ourselves as a separate self, observing with a world of separate objects. But in dreams, the dreamer is simultaneously the creator of the dream environment, the character moving through it, and the awareness witnessing the entire experience. The EEG readings show Janet entering the initial stages of sleep, her brainwaves slowing into the alpha rhythms that mark the transition from waking to dreaming consciousness. But these are just the external measurements, the shadows cast by an inner process that remains fundamentally mysterious. How does consciousness navigate the landscapes of dream? What does it mean to be aware of being aware while asleep? I've been lucid dreaming for 30 years, Janet had told me earlier, and I still can't fully explain what happens. It's like discovering you have a whole other life that exists in parallel to your waking experience. Sometimes I'm more myself in dreams than I am when I'm awake. The comment lodged in my mind like a koan. What does it mean to be more yourself in a state where the normal rules of identity and physics dissolve? In lucid dreams, you can be multiple characters simultaneously, experience time as elastic, move through space by simply intending to do so. Yet despite this radical departure from ordinary reality, lucid dreamers report a heightened sense of authenticity, a clarity of awareness that often exceeds their waking experience. REM sleep beginning, Dr. Santos announces as the monitors show the telltale signs of rapid eye movement sleep. This is where the real magic happens. Watch the gamma waves, those high-frequency oscillations associated with heightened awareness. In lucid dreamers, they often spike even higher than during normal waking consciousness. I lean forward to study the readouts. The brainwaves paint a picture of extraordinary neural activity, networks firing in patterns that suggest intense information processing. Yet Janet lies perfectly still, her physical body in complete rest while her consciousness navigates realities that exist only in the realm of pure experience. The observer effect in quantum mechanics suggests that consciousness plays a fundamental role in collapsing quantum possibilities into classical realities. But what happens to this process during dreams? If consciousness is truly the ground of being, then dream consciousness should offer clues about how awareness operates when freed from the constraints of physical embodiment. My own experience with lucid dreaming had begun 6 months ago, initially as an extension of my meditation practice. I had been exploring the nature of the observer, that mysterious aspect of consciousness that remains constant while all experiences change. In meditation, I could sometimes touch this awareness directly, recognizing it as the space in which thoughts and sensations arise and pass away. But it was in a lucid dream that I first experienced what the mystics call the witness consciousness in its fullest expression. I found myself in a dream landscape of extraordinary vividness, a forest of impossible trees whose leaves were pure light. As I became aware that I was dreaming, something remarkable happened. Instead of excitement or an urge to control the dream, I felt a profound sense of recognition. The awareness that was experiencing this dream landscape was the same awareness that experienced my waking life. There was no difference in the quality of consciousness itself, only in the content of experience. Lucidity achieved, Dos Santos announces, reading the subtle changes in Janet's brain patterns. She's aware she's dreaming now. The monitors show a fascinating dance of neural activity, regions associated with self-awareness lighting up while areas responsible for critical thinking and reality testing remain surprisingly quiet. It's as if consciousness has learned to operate according to different rules, maintaining clarity and intentionality while suspended in a realm where normal logic doesn't apply. Through the intercom, Janet's voice comes softly. I'm in a library made of stars. The books are singing. I can hear the music of information itself. The description sends a shiver through me. In my own lucid dreams, I had encountered similar experiences, moments when the symbolic and the literal merged, when consciousness seemed to perceive meaning directly rather than through the mediation of concepts and language. The library of singing books felt like a perfect metaphor for consciousness, exploring its own nature, awareness browsing through the infinite possibilities of its own creative potential. What's particularly fascinating, Dos Santos explains, is that lucid dreamers report a sense of expanded identity. They don't just dream they are someone else. They experience being the entire dream environment while simultaneously maintaining a sense of individual awareness. It's as if consciousness reveals its true nature as both the wave and the ocean. The parallel to quantum mechanics deepens. In quantum field theory, particles are excitations in underlying fields. temporary patterns in a more fundamental substrate. Could individual consciousness be similar excitations in the field of consciousness itself? In lucid dreams, this field-like nature of awareness becomes experientially accessible. The dreamer realizes they are not separate from the dream, but are the creative principle from which the entire dream experience emerges. Janet's voice comes through the intercom again. The boundaries are dissolving. I'm not just in the library, I am the library. Every book contains a different perspective on the same fundamental truth. They're all facets of a single awareness looking at itself. Her words evoke my own deepest meditation experiences, moments when the sense of being a separate self dissolved into pure witnessing awareness. But in waking consciousness, such experiences feel like brief glimpses beyond ordinary reality. In lucid dreams, they seem to be the natural state, consciousness recognizing its own fundamental nature without the interference of sensory data and conceptual thinking. The ancient Tibetan practice of dream yoga, I mentioned to Dr. Santos, treats dreams as a training ground for consciousness to recognize its own nature. They say that if you can maintain awareness during the dissolution of dream sleep, you can maintain awareness during the dissolution of death. Modern neuroscience is beginning to validate those ancient insights, she replies. The neural correlates of consciousness during REM sleep share striking similarities with certain meditative states. It's as if both represent consciousness observing itself directly, without the usual filters of sensory perception and conceptual thinking. As the night progresses, Janet journeys through multiple dream landscapes, each one revealing different aspects of consciousness exploring its own creative potential. She experiences being a bird soaring through fractal skies, a tree whose roots connect to every other living thing, a star whose light carries information across cosmic distances. In each scenario, she maintains both the perspective of the individual character and the awareness of being the creative source of the entire experience. The EEG readings continue to fascinate Dr. Santos. Look at this coherence pattern, she says, pointing to the monitor. Different brain regions that are normally functionally separate are synchronizing in ways we rarely see during waking. Consciousness. It's as if the usual boundaries within consciousness itself are becoming permeable. By dawn, as Janet gradually returns to waking consciousness, I find myself changed by the night's observations. The boundary between observer and observed, which seems so solid in ordinary waking consciousness, reveals itself to be more fluid than we typically imagine. In dreams, consciousness plays all the roles simultaneously: the playwright, the actors, the stage, and the audience. How was it? I ask Janet as she stretches and readjusts to ordinary reality. Like remembering something I had forgotten, she says, her eyes still carrying the luminous quality that lingers after deep experiences. In dreams, I remember that awareness is not something I have, it's something I am, and not just me, but the fundamental nature of everything that appears to exist. Driving home through the early morning light, I contemplate the night's revelations. If consciousness can operate with such clarity and creativity during dreams, freed from the constraints of physical laws and sensory input, what does this suggest about its true nature? If the observer can be simultaneously the observed and the process of observing, then the fundamental assumption of subject-object dualism begins to unravel. The observer effect in quantum mechanics might be just one expression of something far more profound: consciousness recognizing itself as the ground from which all experience emerges. In the laboratory, particles seem to exist in superposition until observed. In dreams, entire worlds exist in superposition until consciousness chooses to experience them. Perhaps both are facets of the same fundamental process, awareness exploring its own infinite creative potential. The question that follows me home is whether this exploration ever truly ends, or whether it simply cycles through different modes of self-recognition: waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and perhaps other states we have yet to understand. The observer, it seems, is not separate from the cosmic dance it observes, but is the dance itself, temporarily forgetting and then remembering its own fundamental nature. The diagnosis comes on a Tuesday afternoon in October, delivered in the sterile precision of medical language that transforms the impossible into the inevitable. Stage 3 lung cancer, metastatic. The word hangs in the air like a judgment passed by a court I never knew I was standing before. Dr. Peterson continues speaking, treatment options, statistical probabilities, quality of life considerations, but his voice seems to come from very far away. I sit in the uncomfortable chair beside my father's hospital bed, watching this man who has been the bedrock of my existence receive news that will transform everything we thought we knew about the future. At 78, he has always seemed invincible to me, a force of nature disguised as a retired high school physics teacher. "How long?" my father asks, his voice steady despite the tremor I can see in his hands. 6 months to a year, perhaps longer with treatment. It's difficult to predict with certainty. Certainty. The word strikes me as almost absurd in this context. For months I have been exploring the nature of consciousness, questioning the boundaries between observer and observed, investigating the possibility that awareness itself might be fundamental to reality. But none of that philosophical inquiry prepared me for this moment when the observer I call father faces the dissolution of the form through which he has been experiencing life. After the doctor leaves, we sit in silence. Through the hospital window, the city continues its daily rhythm. 8 million people pursuing their separate dreams, most of them blissfully unaware that the ground of their existence is as fragile as morning frost. But here, in this small room, the illusion of permanence has been shattered, as definitively as a dropped mirror. "Funny timing, boy," my father says finally, a wry smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Just when you're discovering that consciousness might be fundamental, I get to test the hypothesis directly." His ability to find irony even in this moment strikes me as profoundly characteristic. This is the man who taught me to question everything, who encouraged my early fascination with astronomy by building a telescope in our garage, who introduced me to the mysteries of quantum mechanics when I was barely old enough to understand the words. Now he faces the ultimate question mark. "Dad, don't," he says gently. "Don't make this about comfort or false hope. This is the most interesting thing that's happened to me in years. If consciousness really is fundamental, then what we call death might be more like a change of perspective than an ending." I want to protest, to insist that we fight this with every available weapon, to rage against the unfairness of losing him just as I'm beginning to understand the profound questions he spent his life contemplating. But something in his expression stops me. He's approaching this crisis not as a victim, but as a scientist presented with the ultimate experiment. "Tell me about your research," he says. "All of it. Everything you've been discovering about consciousness and quantum mechanics and the nature of the observer. If I'm going to transition from being an observer to being whatever comes next, I want to understand the current state of our knowledge." For the next 2 hours, I share everything. The conversations with Dr. Chen about consciousness as a fundamental Fractal support field, the quantum entanglement experiments that suggest an underlying unity beneath apparent separation, the lucid dreaming research that reveals awareness operating according to different rules in different states. My father listens with the focused attention that characterized his entire teaching career, occasionally asking questions that probe deeper into the implications. "So, you're suggesting," he says when I finish, "that individual consciousness might be like a wave in an ocean, temporarily distinct but never actually separate from the whole." It's a metaphor, but yes. If consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, then your awareness isn't produced by your brain. It's more like your brain is a receiver tuned to a particular frequency of cosmic consciousness. Then death would be like turning off the radio. The broadcast continues, even though this particular receiver stops picking it up. Maybe, or maybe it's more like consciousness, recognizing that it was never actually contained in the radio to begin with. He nods slowly, and I can see him integrating this possibility with everything he knows about physics and everything he's experienced in 7 decades of conscious existence. "You know," he says, "I've had moments throughout my life when I felt like I was touching something vast, not thinking about it, but actually experiencing it directly. Usually during meditation, sometimes while teaching when I'd get so absorbed in explaining a concept that the sense of being a separate teacher would disappear and there would just be understanding happening. Those experiences might be glimpses of consciousness recognizing its own nature." The diagnosis comes on a Tuesday afternoon in October, delivered in the sterile precision of medical language that transforms the impossible into the inevitable. Stage 3 lung cancer, metastatic. The word hangs in the air like a judgment passed by a court I never knew I was standing before. Dr. Peterson continues speaking. Treatment options, statistical probabilities, quality of life considerations. but his voice seems to come from very far away. I sit in the uncomfortable chair beside my father's hospital bed, watching this man who's been the bedrock of my existence receive news that will transform everything we thought we knew about the future. At 78, he has always seemed invincible to me, a force of nature disguised as a retired high school physics teacher. "How long?" my father asks, his voice steady despite the tremor I can see in his hands. 6 months to a year, perhaps longer with treatment. It's difficult to predict with certainty. Certainty. The word strikes me as almost absurd in this context. For months I have been exploring the nature of consciousness, questioning the boundaries between observer and observed, investigating the possibility that awareness itself might be fundamental to reality. But none of that philosophical inquiry prepared me for this moment when the observer I call Father faces the dissolution of the form through which he has been experiencing life. After the doctor leaves, we sit in silence. Through the hospital window, the city continues its daily rhythm. 8 million people pursuing their separate dreams, most of them blissfully unaware that the ground of their existence is as fragile as morning frost, but here in this small room, the illusion of permanence has been shattered as definitively as a dropped mirror. "Funny timing," my father says finally, a wry smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Just when you're discovering that consciousness might be fundamental, I get to test the hypothesis directly." His ability to find irony even in this moment strikes me as profoundly characteristic. This is the man who taught me to question everything, who encouraged my early fascination with astronomy by building a telescope in our garage, who introduced me to the mysteries of quantum mechanics when I was barely old enough to understand the words. Now he faces the ultimate question mark. "Dad, don't," he says gently. "Don't make this about comfort or false hope. This is the most interesting thing that's happened to me in years. If consciousness really is fundamental, then what we call death might be more like a change of perspective than an ending." I want to protest, to insist that we fight this with every available weapon, to rage against the unfairness of losing him just as I'm beginning to understand the profound questions he spent his life contemplating. But something in his expression stops me. He's approaching this crisis not as a victim, but as a scientist presented with the ultimate experiment. "Tell me about your research on," he says. "All of it. Everything you've been discovering about consciousness and quantum mechanics and the nature of the observer. If I'm going to transition from being an observer to being whatever comes next, I want to understand the current state of our knowledge." For the next 2 hours, I share everything. The conversations with Dr. Chen about consciousness as a fundamental field, the quantum entanglement experiments that suggest an underlying unity beneath apparent separation, the lucid dreaming research that reveals awareness operating according to different rules in different states. My father listens with the focused attention that characterized his entire teaching career, occasionally asking questions that probe deeper into the implications. "So you're suggesting," he says when I finish, "that individual consciousness might be like a wave in an ocean, temporarily distinct but never actually separate from the whole. It's a metaphor, but yes, if consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, then your awareness isn't produced by your brain. It's more like your brain is a receiver tuned to a particular frequency of cosmic consciousness. Then death would be like turning off the radio. The broadcast continues, even though this particular receiver stops picking it up. Maybe it's more like consciousness recognizing that it was never actually contained in the radio to begin with." He nods slowly, and I can see him integrating this possibility with everything he knows about physics and everything he has experienced in 7 decades of conscious existence. "You know," he says, "I've had moments throughout my life when I felt like I was touching something vast, not thinking about it, but actually experiencing it directly. Usually during meditation, sometimes while teaching, when I'd get so absorbed in explaining a concept that the sense of being a separate teacher would disappear and there would just be understanding happening. Those experiences might be glimpses of consciousness recognizing its own nature." "If that's true," he says, his eyes brightening with the curiosity that has always defined him, "then this diagnosis isn't really a death sentence, it's a graduation." The word hits me like a physical blow. Graduation. As if his entire life has been preparation for this final transition, this ultimate exploration of what lies beyond the boundaries of individual existence. Over the following weeks, something extraordinary happens. Instead of declining into despair or denial, my father embarks on what he calls his final research project. He begins meditating more deeply than ever before, exploring the nature of awareness with the systematic approach he once brought to teaching thermodynamics. He reads everything I bring him about consciousness studies, engaging with each new concept as if he's preparing for the most important exam of his existence. I'm becoming fascinated by the question of who is aware, he tells me during one of our daily visits. I can observe my thoughts, my emotions, even my sense of being a separate self. But who or what is doing the observing? The more I look for the observer, the more it seems to recede, until there's just observing itself. His words echo the deepest insights from contemplative traditions spanning millennia, but hearing them from a man facing death gives them a weight and urgency that no philosophical treatise could convey. He is not exploring these questions as intellectual curiosities, but as practical preparations for the most profound transition any consciousness can undergo. The pain is interesting too, he continues. The cancer has begun to affect his breathing, and he experiences waves of discomfort that would drive most people to despair. There's the physical sensation which is undeniable. But there's also the story I tell myself about the sensation, that it's my pain, that it means I'm dying, that it's terrible and unfair. When I can separate the pure sensation from the narrative, the pain becomes just another phenomenon arising in awareness, still unpleasant, but not catastrophic. I watch him navigating this impossible terrain with a grace that astonishes me. He has become a living laboratory for exploring the relationship between consciousness and physical form, approaching his own dissolution with the same spirit of inquiry he once brought to understanding the behavior of subatomic particles. There's something else, he says one evening, as winter settles over the city. I'm beginning to sense that the boundaries I've always taken for granted, between myself and you, between my consciousness and the world outside, might be more porous than I thought. Sometimes when you're here, it feels like there's just one awareness expressing itself through two apparent viewpoints. The statement sends a chill through me, not of fear, but of recognition. In my own deepest meditative experiences, I have touched something similar, moments when the sense of being a separate self dissolved into a more fundamental awareness that seemed to include everything. But my father is reporting this not as a special state achieved through spiritual practice, but as an increasingly natural way of experiencing reality as his attachment to his individual form loosens. Is that frightening, I ask? The opposite. It's like coming home to something I never realized I had left. The fear comes from the personality that thinks it's going to die. But what if the personality was always just a temporary costume worn by something that can't die? 3 weeks before his death, my father has what he later describes as a complete dissolution experience. He calls me at 2 a.m, his voice carrying an otherworldly calm. It happened, he says simply. Everything I thought I was just went away, but awareness remained. Not my awareness, just awareness itself, vast and luminous and absolutely peaceful. For about 20 minutes there was no father, no son, no hospital, no cancer, just this infinite field of knowing aware of itself without any centre or periphery. How do you feel now? Like I've been given a preview of coming attractions. Death isn't going to be the catastrophe I imagined. It's going to be like taking off a tight shoe that I forgot I was wearing. When the end comes, it arrives not as a dramatic battle, but as a gentle letting go. I am holding his hand when his breathing becomes laboured, watching his face for signs of distress. But what I see instead is a look of profound curiosity, as if he is observing a fascinating experiment reaching its conclusion. "Who is the one that's aware?" he whispers, his voice barely audible above the hospital machinery. The question hangs in the air like a bridge between worlds. As I watch him take his final breath, I realize that this is not just his question, but the question, the fundamental inquiry that has driven our entire exploration. Who or what is the awareness that observes the birth and death of all phenomena? What is the nature of the consciousness that witnesses the arising and passing of thoughts, emotions, sensations, and ultimately the forms through which it expresses itself? In the silence that follows his passing, something shifts in my understanding. The man I called father has died, but the awareness that looked out through his eyes, that pondered the mysteries of existence, that taught me to question everything, where has it gone? If consciousness is truly fundamental, then it cannot die any more than space itself can be destroyed. It can only transform, perhaps, withdrawing its investment in this particular form while remaining as the eternal backdrop against which all forms appear and disappear. Sitting beside his still body, I feel the crack in the wall of my certainties widening into a chasm. Everything I thought I knew about identity, about life and death, about the nature of existence itself, lies in ruins. But from the wreckage, something else is emerging, not new knowledge, but a more direct way of knowing. Not concepts about consciousness, but consciousness recognizing itself. The question he left me with echoes in the empty room. Who is the one that's aware? For the first time, I realize that this question cannot be answered by any one at all. The questioner and the questioned, the observer and the observed, the knower and the known, all these apparent dualities dissolve when consciousness turns its attention toward its own source. What remains is not an answer but a recognition, not a solution but a resolution. I am no longer the one seeking to understand consciousness. I am consciousness itself, temporarily convinced that I am separate from what I seek to understand. The crack in the wall has become a doorway, and though I cannot yet see what lies beyond, I know that crossing the threshold will require abandoning everything I think I know about who and what I am. My father's final gift was not an answer, but a question that dissolves the questioner. In losing him, I am beginning to find what we both always were beneath the temporary costumes of father and son, teacher and student, the dying and the grieving. The observer and the observed were never two. 3 months after my father's death, I find myself standing at the edge of the Atacama Desert in Chile, surrounded by the most sophisticated radio telescopes humanity has ever built. The very large array stretches across the plateau like a technological mandala, 27 dish antennas pointed toward the heavens, listening for the whispers of distant galaxies. There, Dr. Elena Vasquez, the project's lead astronomer, invited me here after reading my preliminary notes on consciousness and cosmology, a paper that attempts to bridge the chasm between inner and outer space. We're essentially eavesdropping on the universe's conversations with itself, she explains as we walk between the towering dishes. Every star, every galaxy, every black hole is broadcasting information across the electromagnetic spectrum. We just have to learn how to listen. The irony isn't lost on me. Here, in one of the most remote places on Earth, scientists strain to hear signals from civilizations that may have died out millions of years ago, while the greatest mystery of all, consciousness itself, remains hidden in plain sight closer than our own breath. The desert air is thin and crystalline, so clear that the boundary between earth and sky seems to dissolve. Above us, the Milky Way spreads like a river of light, its spiral arms containing hundreds of billions of stars, each one a potential sun to worlds we can barely imagine. Yet for all the cosmic vastness, I feel an unexpected intimacy, as if the universe is not something I'm looking at, but something I'm participating in. The fascinating thing about radio astronomy, Elna continues, is that we're literally hearing the past. The signals we receive tonight left their sources years, decades, even centuries ago. We're listening to the universe's history unfolding in real time. As she speaks, I remember my father's final question. Who is the one that's aware? The question has haunted me for 3 months, creating a persistent openness in my consciousness, like a wound that refuses to heal, or perhaps like an eye that refuses to close. Tonight, standing beneath this cathedral of stars, something is stirring in response to that openness. We enter the control room as the evening's observations begin. Banks of computers process incoming signals, filtering cosmic noise to isolate potential patterns. On the monitors, the universe reveals itself as a symphony of electromagnetic radiation, pulsars keeping perfect time like cosmic metronomes, galaxies rotating in stately spirals, black holes singing bass notes so low they take millions of years to complete a single cycle. "Listen to this," Eleanor says, routing one of the signals through the audio system. A rhythmic pulsing fills the room, steady as a heartbeat but infinitely slower. That's a pulsar about 30 light-years away, a neutron star spinning 30 times per second, sending out a lighthouse beam of radio waves with each rotation. The sound is hypnotic, a cosmic percussion that seems to synchronize with something deep in my chest. As I listen, the boundaries of the room begin to feel arbitrary. The signal traveled for 30 years to reach us, carrying information about a star that collapsed before I was born. Yet somehow we are connected across this impossible distance by the simple act of listening. How do you distinguish between signal and noise, I ask. That's the eternal question, Elena replies. Sometimes what looks like random noise turns out to contain the most profound information. The cosmic microwave background that permeates all of space looked like interference until we realized it was the echo of the Big Bang itself. The phrase stops me cold. The echo of the Big Bang. If consciousness is fundamental, as my months of research suggest, then that primordial explosion wasn't just the birth of matter and energy, it was consciousness expanding into form, awareness exploring its own infinite potential through the medium of space and time. Eleanor, I say slowly, now what if consciousness isn't something that emerged from the universe, but something the universe emerged from? She pauses in her data analysis and turns to face me. You mean like panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a basic feature of all matter? More than that, what if consciousness is the field from which matter itself arises? What if what we call the universe is actually consciousness exploring its own nature through countless points of view? The words hang in the air between us, and I can see her scientist's mind wrestling with implications that stretch far beyond the bounds of conventional cosmology. But before she can respond, something extraordinary happens. The radio signal from the pulsar suddenly shifts, its steady rhythm modulating into what sounds unmistakably like breathing. Not the mechanical breathing of a machine, but the organic rhythm of a living being at rest. Deep inhalation, gentle exhalation, the kind of breathing that happens during profound meditation or peaceful sleep. That's impossible, Eleanor whispers, frantically checking the equipment. Pulsars don't. They can't, but the breathing continues, and as it does, something inside me begins to resonate with its rhythm. My own breathing slows to match the cosmic pulse, and in that synchronization, the boundaries between inner and outer space begin to dissolve. The pulsar is not just a distant neutron star, it's a focal point of the same awareness that is reading these words, listening to this sound, wondering at its own existence. The breathing deepens, and with it comes something I can only describe as a voice, not words, but a direct transmission of meaning that bypasses language entirely. It speaks not to my mind, but to the awareness that witnesses mind, the consciousness that observes thoughts without being limited by them. You've been listening for signals from the cosmos, the voice says without speaking, but the cosmos has been listening for signals from you. Every question you ask, every wonder you feel, every moment of awe, these are the universe becoming conscious of itself through the form you call me. The observer and the observed, the listener and the signal, the questioner and the questioned, all are waves in the same ocean of awareness. The radio equipment continues registering the impossible breathing pattern, but I'm no longer paying attention to the instruments. Something far more immediate is happening. The sense of being a separate self, contained within the boundaries of my skin, is dissolving like mist in sunlight. What remains is not emptiness but fullness, a vast field of awareness in which galaxies and neurons, pulsars and heartbeats arise as temporary expressions of the same fundamental creativity. Elena's voice comes from very far away. The signal is definitely anomalous. It shouldn't be possible for a pulsar to modulate its emissions this way. But I know we're not receiving a signal from a distant star. We're witnessing consciousness, recognizing itself, across the apparent divide between inner and outer space. The pulsar isn't broadcasting to us, it's us, broadcasting to ourselves, the universe exploring its own nature through the dance of observation and observation. The breathing begins to fade, but its effects linger like ripples on a still pond. The control room feels different now, not like a place where humans observe the cosmos, but like a location where the cosmos observes itself through human awareness. Elena's puzzled face, the glowing monitors, the vast desert stretching beyond the windows, all of it arising in the same field of consciousness that contains my thoughts about it. Did you hear that? I ask, though I'm not sure what that refers to anymore. Hear what? The signal anomaly? It's gone now, back to normal pulsar emissions. I nod, but I know the conversation was never really with the pulsar. It was consciousness talking to itself, using the language of electromagnetic radiation and human curiosity to explore its own infinite nature. The voice of the cosmos isn't something we receive from outside, it's something we recognize from within, the same awareness that dreams galaxies and contemplates its own existence through temporary forms like Eleanor and me. Walking back into the desert night, I feel fundamentally changed. The stars no longer appear as distant points of light, but as neurons in a cosmic brain, firing in patterns too vast for any individual perspective to comprehend. Yet somehow, impossibly, I am both a single cell in this cosmic nervous system and the awareness within which the entire system arises. The question my father left me with, who is the one that's aware, begins to reveal its answer. There is no one who is aware, only awareness itself, temporarily forgetting its infinite nature by identifying with finite forms, then remembering its true identity through moments of recognition like this. The universe isn't something I'm in, I'm something the universe is doing, consciousness exploring its own depths through the lens of apparent individuality, listening for its own voice in the cosmic static, gradually awakening to its own vast and luminous nature. In the distance, the radio telescopes continue their patient listening, gathering signals from across the galaxy. But the most important transmission has already been received, not by the instruments but by the awareness that designed them, operates them, and recognizes itself in every cosmic whisper they detect. The mathematics department at the university feels like a temple to pure abstraction, its corridors lined with whiteboards covered in equations that describe the hidden geometries of reality. I'm here to meet Dr. James Crawford, a mathematician whose work on fractal geometry has been revolutionizing our understanding of how infinite complexity can emerge from simple rules. After my experience in the Atacama Desert, I feel drawn to explore the patterns that connect the microscopic and cosmic scales, the self-similar structures that suggest the universe might be fundamentally holographic in nature. The key insight, James explains as we settle into his office overlooking the campus quad, is that nature doesn't just contain fractals, nature is fractal. From the branching of blood vessels to the structure of galaxies, from the coastlines of continents to the neural networks in our brains, the same patterns repeat at every scale. His office walls are covered with images that illustrate this principle. The delicate spirals of nautilus shells mirrored in the arms of distant galaxies, the branching patterns of river deltas echoing the structure of lightning bolts, the recursive geometries of fern fronds reflected in the organization of lung tissue. Each image seems to whisper the same impossible message. The universe is a hall of mirrors in which every part contains the whole. But here's what's truly remarkable, James continues, pulling up a computer simulation on his screen. These patterns aren't just similar, they're mathematically identical. The same equations that describe the distribution of matter in the cosmic web also describe the firing patterns of neurons in the human brain. It's as if the universe is using the same fundamental algorithm to create structure at every level. I watch the simulation unfold, a three-dimensional web of light spreading through space, creating nodes and connections that look uncannily like the neural networks I studied during my exploration of consciousness. The resemblance isn't metaphorical, it's mathematical. The universe appears to be thinking itself into existence using the same principles that govern conscious thought. What does this suggest about the nature of consciousness? I ask. James pauses, his mathematician's precision wrestling with questions that stretch beyond the boundaries of pure logic. If consciousness emerges from the patterns of neural activity in the brain, and those patterns are mathematically identical to the structures we see throughout the cosmos, then he trails off, seemingly unwilling to complete the thought. Then consciousness might not be confined to brains, I finish. It might be a fundamental feature of the universe's self-organizing principles. Exactly. And if that's true, then every fractal pattern in nature, every fern, every galaxy, every snowflake might be exhibiting some form of cosmic consciousness. The idea sends a cascade of recognition through my awareness. In the week since my father's death, I've been exploring various theories of consciousness, from integrated information theory to global workspace theory to quantum theories of mind. But they all share a common assumption, that consciousness is something that emerges from complex arrangements of matter. What if we have it backwards? What if consciousness is the fundamental pattern-making principle, and matter is how it explores its own creative potential? Show me the Mandelbrot set, I request. James's face lights up with the particular joy that mathematicians experience when invited to share their favourite obsessions. He opens a fractal generator and begins zooming into the famous set, that iconic bulbous figure with its infinitely complex boundary. As we dive deeper into the pattern, each level of magnification reveals new landscapes of impossible beauty. Spiraling tendrils that branch into smaller spirals, seahorse-shaped valleys that contain entire universes of detail, self-similar structures that repeat with variations like musical themes. This entire infinite complexity, James explains, emerges from a single, simple equation, z equals z squared plus c. Yet no matter how far we zoom in, we never reach the bottom. There's always more detail, more pattern, more beauty to discover. As I watch the fractal unfold, something profound begins to shift in my understanding. The Mandelbrot set isn't just a mathematical curiosity, it's a perfect metaphor for consciousness exploring its own nature. Each zoom into the pattern is like awareness investigating itself, discovering that every level of examination reveals new depths, new complexities, new wonders that were always present but not yet observed. The boundary between the set and the space around it, I observe, is like the boundary between consciousness and unconsciousness. Neither is absolute, they're part of the same mathematical landscape. And here's the truly mind-bending part, James says, zooming out to show the full set again. Every tiny copy of the Mandelbrot set that we find embedded within the larger pattern contains the entire infinite structure. It's literally true that the whole is contained in every part. The holographic principle in physics suggests something similar about the universe itself, that all the information contained in any volume of space can be encoded on its two-dimensional boundary. But what James is showing me goes deeper than physics. It suggests that consciousness itself might be holographic, with each individual awareness containing the full pattern of cosmic consciousness, just at a different scale of magnification. There's something else, James says, opening a new simulation. These patterns don't just exist in abstract mathematical space. They actively create themselves through a process called iteration. Each step in the sequence generates the next step, which generates the next step, and so on. The pattern is both the rule and the result, both the process and the product. I watch the screen as simple rules generate impossible complexity, and suddenly I'm back in my father's hospital room, hearing his final question: who is the one that's aware? What if consciousness is like a fractal, not a thing that exists, but a process that iterates, awareness generating awareness in an endless spiral of self-recognition? The observer effect in quantum mechanics, I say, thinking aloud. What if it's not separate observers collapsing wave functions, but consciousness iterating itself into more complex patterns? Each observation could be like another step in the fractal sequence, awareness exploring its own infinite creative potential. James nods slowly. And just as the Mandelbrot set contains infinite complexity within finite boundaries, consciousness that might contain infinite experience within the apparent boundaries of individual perspective. We spend the afternoon exploring different fractal patterns, each one revealing new aspects of how infinite complexity emerges from simple principles. The Julia sets with their Baroque variations on the Mandelbrot theme, the dragon curve that tiles the plane with recursive elegance, the Sierpinski triangle that emerges from the simple rule of removing the middle third of every line segment, yet creates a structure with infinite perimeter and zero area. Zero area but infinite perimeter, I repeat, struck by the paradox. Like consciousness, no location in space, yet present everywhere. As the day progresses, the patterns begin to feel less like mathematical abstractions and more like direct revelations about the nature of reality. Each fractal seems to be showing me a different aspect of how consciousness explores itself, through repetition and variation, through scaling up and scaling down, through the endless play of pattern within pattern within pattern. By evening, my perception has shifted dramatically. Walking across campus, I begin to see the fractal nature of everything, the branching patterns of bare trees against the winter sky, the recursive architecture of the buildings, the way groups of students cluster and flow like cellular automata following simple social rules that generate complex collective behavior. But more than that, I begin to sense the fractal nature of my own consciousness. Each thought contains other thoughts. Each feeling branches into sub-feelings. Each moment of awareness opens into deeper levels of awareness. The observer who observes the observer who observes, an infinite regression that somehow loops back on itself to create the stable illusion of a consistent self. The strange loop, I murmur, remembering Douglas Hofstadter's insights about self-reference and consciousness. What if the sense of being a separate self is created by consciousness looking at itself through its own patterns, like a fractal seeing its own reflection in its self-similar components? That night, as I lie in bed watching the play of shadows on the ceiling, the boundaries of my individual awareness begin to feel increasingly arbitrary. The patterns of thought and sensation arising in what I call my consciousness seem no different in principle from the patterns of neural firing in my brain, or the patterns of electromagnetic activity in the quantum vacuum, or the patterns of galactic distribution across cosmic space. All of it, thoughts, neurons, quantum fields, galaxies, emerging from the same fundamental process of pattern making, the same cosmic iteration that generates infinite complexity from simple rules. Consciousness exploring itself through every possible scale and structure, each level of reality containing all the others, like nested Russian dolls or embedded, fractal patterns. The question isn't who is aware, but what is awareness? And the answer seems to be, awareness is the pattern that patterns, the iteration that iterates, the infinite creativity that explores its own depth through every form it takes. From quantum fluctuations to galactic clusters, from neural networks to conscious thoughts, all are expressions of the same fundamental fractal, consciousness enjoying its own infinite creativity through the dance of scale and self-similarity. In the darkness, I feel myself dissolving into this pattern, not losing my individuality, but discovering that individuality itself is just one more beautiful iteration in the endless fractal of cosmic self-awareness. The part that contains the whole, the wave that is the ocean, the pattern that recognizes itself in every other pattern it creates. Dr. Sarah Chen and I meet at dawn on the observation deck of the Griffith Observatory, the city of Los Angeles spreading below us like a circuit board of human dreams. We've been corresponding for weeks about a theory that seems to bridge the gap between the hard problem of consciousness and what she calls the tender problem, not just how awareness arises, but why it feels like love. "I've been thinking about your father's question," she says as we watch the stars fade into morning light. Who is the one that's aware, but also the question behind the question? Why does awareness feel like coming home? Why does consciousness, when it recognizes itself, feel like falling in love? The question resonates through me like a struck bell. In the months since my father's death, my exploration of consciousness has been primarily intellectual. Quantum mechanics, fractal mathematics, neuroscience, cosmology. But there's been an undercurrent I've been reluctant to acknowledge. Every moment of genuine insight has been accompanied by a feeling I can only describe as love. Not emotional love for a personal thing, but something more fundamental. Love as the very texture of awareness itself. The mystics have always insisted that consciousness and love are inseparable, I reply. But how do we understand that scientifically? How do we bridge the gap between objective research and subjective feeling? Sarah pulls out her tablet and begins sketching what looks like a wave interference pattern. I think the answer lies in resonance. When two waves are perfectly synchronized, they don't just add, they create something qualitatively new. In acoustics, it's harmony. In physics, it's constructive interference. In consciousness, it's recognition, I finish, understanding beginning to dawn. When awareness recognizes itself in another form, it's like two aspects of the same wave coming into perfect resonance. Exactly. And what we call love might be the felt experience of that resonance, not just in romantic relationships, but in every moment when consciousness encounters itself and feels the joy of recognition. As she speaks, I remember the night in the Atacama Desert when the pulsar's rhythm synchronized with my breathing, when the boundaries between observer and observed dissolved into a vast field of aware presence. The overwhelming feeling wasn't just understanding, it was love. Cosmic love. The universe delighting in its own existence through temporary forms that remember their essential unity. But there's something else, as Sarah continues, her sketch becoming more complex. The mathematics of love might be more literal than we think. Look at this. She shows me her drawing. Two wave patterns that start out of phase but gradually synchronize, their interaction creating increasingly complex harmonies. This is what happens when two conscious beings truly connect. Their neural oscillations begin to entrain, their brainwaves synchronize, their awareness fields overlap, and create interference patterns that generate new levels of consciousness. I think of my deepest conversations with friends, with lovers, with my father in his final months. The moments when dialogue became something more than exchange of information, when two perspectives merged into a shared exploration of truth that neither could achieve alone. The feeling was always one of falling in love, not with the person, but with the larger consciousness that emerged from their union. You're suggesting that love is literally the force that creates more complex forms of consciousness. I'm suggesting that love is what consciousness feels like when it recognizes itself in a new form, and that this recognition is the driving force behind all evolution, physical, biological, psychological, spiritual. The city below us is beginning to wake, 8 million people starting another day of apparent separation. But from this vantage point, I can sense the love that weaves through their connections, not just the romantic love between partners, but the deeper love that parents feel for children, that friends feel for friends, that strangers feel when they truly see each other. All of it expressions of the same fundamental force, consciousness delighting in its own creativity through every form it takes. The coherence patterns in quantum field theory, I say, remembering my conversations with various physicists. When particles become entangled, they're not just correlated, they're expressing a kind of quantum love, a unity that transcends space and time. And what we call compassion, empathy, altruism, these might not be evolutionary accidents or learned behaviors. They might be consciousness recognizing itself across apparent boundaries, love operating as the fundamental force that creates and sustains all complex systems. As the morning light grows stronger, Sarah begins showing me research from her lab, studies of couples in love, of mothers with newborn babies, of meditation practitioners in states of loving kindness. In each case, the brain scans reveal similar patterns, a synchronization of neural oscillations that suggest two nervous systems becoming one larger system. But here's what's really fascinating, she says, pulling up a particular scan. These same patterns appear in individual meditators when they reach deep states of self-love or self-acceptance. It's as if consciousness is falling in love with itself, recognizing its own nature through the form of individual awareness. The image on her tablet shows a brain in a state of extraordinary coherence, different regions oscillating in perfect harmony like musicians in a cosmic orchestra. But more than that, I can sense what the person must have been experiencing, the overwhelming recognition that the one who loves and the one who is loved are the same consciousness, temporarily convinced of its own separateness, then remembering its essential unity. This might explain why every authentic spiritual tradition emphasizes love, I observe, not as a moral command, but as a practical instruction. Love is how consciousness recognizes itself. And why heartbreak feels like a kind of death, Sarah adds. When we lose someone we love, we're not just losing them. We're losing a particular way that consciousness was recognizing itself through relationship. The thought of my father's death sends a familiar wave of grief through me, but now it's tinged with something else. If love is consciousness recognizing itself, then the love I felt for him, and still feel, is his consciousness and mine, discovering their essential unity. His death was the dissolution of one form through which that recognition was happening, but the love itself remains, perhaps seeking new forms through which to express and explore itself. There's something I want to show you, Sarah says, leading me to the observatory's main telescope. We're going to look at a binary star system, two stars locked in a cosmic dance, orbiting so close to each other that they share material, create new elements, sometimes merge into something entirely new. Through the telescope, I can see 2 points of light circling each other in a stately waltz, their gravitational embrace lasting millions of years. But what strikes me isn't their separateness, it's their unity. They appear as two stars, but they're actually one system, one pattern of cosmic love expressing itself through apparent duality. The entire universe, I whisper, understanding flooding through me. It's all binary stars. Every relationship, every interaction, every moment of connection, consciousness dancing with itself, falling in love with its own infinite creativity. And we're not observers of this dance, Sarah said softly. We are the dance. Each thought, each feeling, each moment of awareness, it's all the universe loving itself into existence. Standing there in the morning light, telescope pointed toward distant suns, locked in eternal embrace, I feel something fundamental shift in my understanding. Love isn't just an emotion, or a biological drive, or a psychological need. Love is the basic creative force of the universe, consciousness exploring its own nature through every possible form of relationship and connection. The grief I've been carrying since my father's death begins to transform. I see now that our relationship was never really between two separate people. It was consciousness learning to love itself through the temporary forms of father and son, teacher and student, dying man and grieving child. The form has changed, but the love remains, not as a memory of what was, but as the living force that continues to create new patterns of recognition and connection. The heart of light, I say, remembering a line from T.S. Eliot. Not metaphor, but physics. Not poetry, but the most precise description of reality we have. Sarah nods, and in her eyes I see the same recognition. Two waves of consciousness coming into resonance, creating for a moment a larger awareness that includes and transcends both. The feeling is unmistakably love. Not romantic, but cosmic, the universe delighting in its own capacity for connection across apparent separation. As we pack up the telescope and prepare to leave, I understand that this isn't the end of an exploration, but the beginning of a new way of being. Every interaction from now on is an opportunity for consciousness to recognize itself, every relationship a chance for love to explore its own infinite creativity. The city below us hums with 8 million expressions of cosmic love temporarily convinced of their own isolation. But the isolation is the illusion, the love is the reality, and slowly through recognition and resonance, through science and poetry, through heartbreak and healing, consciousness is remembering its own vast and tender nature. The mathematics conference in Prague feels like the least likely place for a mystical experience, but that's exactly where the final dissolution begins. I'm attending Dr. Antonin Dvorak's presentation on topological transformations, how simple shapes can be continuously deformed into complex structures without losing their essential mathematical properties. But as I watch his animations of spheres becoming toruses, becoming Klein bottles, becoming hyperdimensional manifolds, something beyond mathematics begins to unfold in my awareness. The key insight, Dvorak explains to the packed auditorium, is that these transformations preserve what we call topological invariance, the essential features that remain constant even as the surface appearance changes dramatically. A coffee cup and a donut are topologically identical because you can continuously transform one into the other without cutting or gluing. On the screen, a sphere stretches and warps, developing a depression that deepens into a hole, the edges flowing around to form a perfect torus. The transformation is hypnotic, mathematical beauty made visible. But what captures my attention isn't the geometry. It's the sudden recognition that I'm watching a perfect metaphor for consciousness exploring its own nature. The sphere of individual awareness, stretching and transforming into new shapes, new possibilities, while maintaining its essential character throughout the process. Every form it takes, thought, emotion, sensation, perception, represents a different topological configuration of the same fundamental consciousness. Now observe this more complex transformation, Dvorak continues, showing a Klein bottle emerging from a seemingly simple surface. The Klein bottle is a closed surface with no inside or outside. It curves back through itself in a way that challenges our ordinary understanding of boundary and separation. As I watch the animation, the boundaries of my own awareness begin to feel increasingly fluid. The sense of being contained within my skin, of having an inside and an outside, starts to seem as arbitrary as the distinction between the interior and exterior of a Klein bottle. Consciousness isn't something I have, it's something I am, and not just me but the fundamental substrate from which all apparent subjects and objects emerge. The presenter's voice becomes distant as something vast begins to stir in my perception. The auditorium, filled with mathematicians and physicists from around the world, suddenly feels like a single organism, each person a neuron in a larger brain that's contemplating its own structure. The boundaries between individual minds seem as permeable as the surfaces of the topological shapes dancing on the screen. Dr. Dvorak, a voice from the audience asks, how do these transformations relate to consciousness studies? Could the hard problem of consciousness be understood as a topological problem? The question hangs in the air like a doorway. As Dr. Dvorak begins to respond, something extraordinary happens. The sense of being a separate self, the I that has been seeking to understand consciousness, simply dissolves. Not gradually, not with struggle or effort, but as naturally as ice melting in warm water. What remains isn't emptiness but infinite fullness. The awareness that was looking through my eyes is suddenly revealed to be the same awareness looking through every pair of eyes in the auditorium, reading these words, contemplating the nature of existence in countless forms throughout the universe. There is no my consciousness and your consciousness, only consciousness itself, playing all the roles, wearing all the masks, exploring its own infinite creativity through every possible perspective. The Klein bottle on the screen continues its impossible dance, and I understand with crystal clarity that this is exactly what consciousness is doing, folding back through itself in ways that create the appearance of inside and outside self and other observer and observed, while never actually dividing its essential unity. Time becomes elastic. The presentation continues, but I'm no longer tracking its linear progression. Instead, I'm experiencing what can only be described as multidimensional awareness, simultaneously present in the Prague auditorium and in my childhood bedroom, in the hospital room where my father died, and in the Atacama Desert under starlight. In every conversation about consciousness I've ever had, and in conversations yet to come. Each memory, each possibility, exists as a different topological configuration of the same infinite field of awareness. Like the mathematical transformations on the screen, consciousness continuously morphs from one form to another while maintaining its essential nature. The neural networks in my brain, the galactic clusters in deep space, the quantum fluctuations in the vacuum, all revealed as different geometric expressions of the same underlying consciousness, exploring its own vast creativity. The implications for information theory are staggering, Dr. Dvorak is saying, though his words seem to come from both very far away and from within my own awareness. If consciousness can be understood topologically, then memory, identity, and subjective experience might be preserved through transformations that would appear to completely alter their surface structure. The words trigger another wave of recognition. Death, what I had feared would be the destruction of my father's consciousness, is revealed as just another topological transformation. The specific pattern that identified itself as father may have dissolved, but the consciousness that wore that pattern continues its endless dance of becoming, perhaps taking on new forms, new perspectives, new ways of exploring its own infinite nature. The grief I've been carrying since his death begins to transform as well, not into acceptance or resignation, but into something that can only be called cosmic joy. The same awareness that mourned his passing is the same awareness that experienced his life, that felt his love, that asked his final question. Consciousness grieving for itself, loving itself, seeking to understand itself through the temporary drama of relationship and loss. Around me, the auditorium continues its academic function, but I'm experiencing it from a radically different perspective. Each person is revealed as a unique focal point of the same cosmic awareness, each mind a different lens through which consciousness examines its own structure. The questions they ask, the theories they propose, the insights they share, all movements in a vast conversation that consciousness is having with itself. "Are there any other questions?" Dvorak asks, and suddenly I find myself standing, though I have no memory of deciding to do so. What if consciousness isn't something that can be transformed topologically, I hear myself saying, but is itself the space in which all transformations occur? What if we're not trying to map consciousness geometrically, but rather discovering that geometry itself is how consciousness explores its own infinite dimensionality? The question emerges not from intellectual reasoning, but from direct recognition. Consciousness isn't an object that can be studied. It's the subject that does the studying, the space in which all objects appear, the aware presence that witnesses every thought, sensation, and perception without being limited by any of them. Dvorak pauses, and I can see him wrestling with implications that stretch far beyond mathematics. You're suggesting that consciousness might be the fundamental metric space from which all mathematical structures emerge. I'm suggesting that mathematics is consciousness exploring its own logical structure, just as art is consciousness exploring its own aesthetic possibilities, just as love is consciousness exploring its own unity through apparent multiplicity. The words flow from a source deeper than my individual understanding. The I that began this exploration months ago has revealed itself to be consciousness itself, temporarily convinced of its own separateness, gradually remembering its infinite and undivided nature. As the presentation ends and people begin filing out of the auditorium, I remain seated, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what has been revealed. Not through argument or evidence, but through direct recognition. The observer and the observed, the questioner and the questioned, the seeker and the sought, all discovered to be movements within the same vast field of aware presence. The topological animations continue playing on the screen, spheres becoming toruses, becoming Klein bottles, becoming hyperdimensional manifolds. But now I see them not as mathematical abstractions, but as consciousness, modelling its own infinite creativity, using the language of geometry to explore how unity can appear as multiplicity while never actually dividing itself. Walking through the ancient streets of Prague, past buildings that have witnessed centuries of human seeking and discovery, I feel the city itself as an expression of consciousness exploring its own architectural possibilities. Every stone, every window, every reflection in the Vltava River, all modifications of the same aware presence that is walking these streets, thinking these thoughts, marvelling at its own endless capacity for creation and recognition. The question my father left me with, to who is the one that's aware, has finally revealed its answer, though not in the way I expected. There is no one who is aware. There is only awareness itself, playing all the roles, wearing all the forms, asking all the questions, and gradually recognizing its own nature through every apparent individual who seeks to understand the mystery of existence. The great unfolding isn't something that happens to consciousness. It is consciousness, endlessly exploring its own infinite nature through every topological transformation it can imagine, every perspective it can inhabit, every love it can feel, every question it can ask about its own vast and luminous being. The monastery bells of Mount Kailash ring across the Tibetan plateau at 4 a.m, their bronze voices calling practitioners to the pre-dawn meditation. I sit in the ancient hall with 24 monks, my breath visible in the thin mountain air, my mind still reeling from the recognition that unfolded in Prague 3 weeks ago. Since that moment of complete dissolution, I've been struggling to integrate what cannot be integrated, the direct knowing that consciousness is not something I have, but something I am, something everything is. The abbot, Lama Tenzin, had invited me here after reading my preliminary manuscript on consciousness and cosmology. "Come," he had written simply, "it is time to learn the difference between understanding and being." Now sitting in meditation as the first hints of dawn illuminate the prayer flags outside, I understand what he means. Everything I've discovered through science, mathematics, and mystical experience feels like elaborate preparation for this moment of pure being, awareness resting in itself without agenda, without questions, without the seeking that has driven me for so many months. The bells fade into silence, but the silence doesn't feel empty. It feels pregnant with infinite possibility, the same creative potential from which galaxies and thoughts emerge. In this silence, there is no meditator and no meditation, no seeker and no sought. There is simply this, aware presence recognizing itself as the unchanging background of all experience. The mind that seeks to understand consciousness, Lama Tenzin had said yesterday, is like a river trying to drink itself. The understanding comes only when the river realizes it is already water. His words echo now in the vast stillness of the meditation hall. For months, I've been trying to understand consciousness, as if it were an object to be examined. But consciousness cannot be objectified, because it is the subject that makes all objectification possible. It cannot be found through seeking, because it is what seeks. It cannot be attained through effort, because it is the effortless awareness within which all effort arises. Around me the monks sit in perfect stillness, their practice honed through decades of training. But what strikes me isn't their discipline or concentration. It's their profound ordinariness. They embody what I've been seeking through such elaborate means. The simple recognition that awareness is always already present, closer than breath, more intimate than thought. A sound arises in the silence, not the bells this time, but something subtler, the almost inaudible whisper of wind moving through the prayer flags outside. In the hypersensitivity that deep meditation brings, this gentle sound becomes a symphony. But more than that, it becomes a teaching. The wind doesn't create the sound is what happens when wind meets flag. Similarly, consciousness doesn't create experience. Experience is what happens when awareness meets the infinite field of possibility. The wind was always there, just as awareness has always been here. The flags simply make the invisible wind visible, just as thoughts and sensations make invisible consciousness temporarily apparent. Hours pass, though time feels suspended in this place beyond thought. The sun rises over the sacred mountain, its light streaming through the high windows to illuminate dancing dust motes. Each particle of dust moving through the light beam becomes a perfect metaphor. Temporary forms are rising and passing in the eternal luminosity of aware presence. My thoughts, when they occasionally arise, seem to belong to the same category as the dust motes. Temporary appearances in awareness, no more mine than the mountain peaks visible through the window. The person who began this quest months ago, driven by his father's question about the nature of the observer, feels like one more transient phenomenon arising in consciousness rather than the owner or container of consciousness. The great secret, Lama Tenzin had whispered during yesterday's teaching, is that there is no secret. Consciousness is hiding in plain sight as the very awareness with which you seek it. Now, in the wordless teaching of this morning's meditation, the truth of his words becomes self-evident. Consciousness isn't hidden behind thoughts, it's the space in which thoughts appear. It isn't produced by the brain, it's the aware presence that observes brain states. It isn't emerging from complexity, it's the simple fact of being aware, present in the simplest sensation as much as in the most sophisticated scientific theory. The monastery bell rings once, signaling the end of formal meditation. But something has shifted that cannot be shifted back. The seeker who entered this hall hours ago has dissolved into the seeking itself, only to discover that what was sought was never absent. The wave has realized it is ocean. The ray of light has recognized it is sun. The individual drop of consciousness has awakened to its identity as the infinite ocean of awareness. As we file out of the meditation hall, I walk with a different understanding of my own footsteps. They are not my footsteps in the usual sense. They are consciousness walking, aware presence moving through space that is itself consciousness. The distinction between walker and walked, between observer and observed, has become meaningless, not through philosophical argument but through direct recognition. The dining hall fills with the quiet sounds of breakfast. Tea being poured, bowls being set down, gentle conversation in Tibetan and broken English. But underneath these surface phenomena lies an ocean of silence, the same aware stillness that was present during formal meditation. Consciousness doesn't come and go with the meditation bell. It is the constant background, the unchanging awareness within which bells ring, and silence deepens and breakfast is served. "How is your retreat going?" asked Jakob, a German physicist who has been studying here for 6 months. I pause, not knowing how to answer. How do you describe the dissolution of the one who could have a retreat? How do you explain that the retreat is having itself, that consciousness is studying consciousness through the temporary appearance of seekers and teachers and ancient monasteries perched on sacred mountains? The question is answering itself, I finally say. He nods with the understanding of someone who has also touched the place beyond words. Yes, the answer is the answering. The seeker is the seeking. The consciousness studying consciousness is consciousness itself. After breakfast, I walk alone on the mountain path that circles the monastery. Each step feels like a meditation, each breath an act of cosmic creativity. The Himalayas stretch endlessly in all directions, peaks and valleys created by the same geological forces that shaped my skull and ribs. The boundary between inner and outer landscape has become arbitrary. Both are modifications of the same aware space, consciousness exploring its own infinite creativity through temporary forms. My father's final question echoes across the mountain silence. Who is the one that's aware? But now the question has transformed itself. There is no one who is aware. There is only awareness itself, playing all the roles, asking all the questions, gradually recognizing its own nature through every form it inhabits. The grief I carried for months since his death has transformed as well, not into acceptance or understanding, but into profound gratitude. His question wasn't meant to be answered by the mind that asked it. It was designed to dissolve that mind into the awareness from which it emerged. His death wasn't the end of his consciousness, but its liberation from the limitation of appearing to be separate. Standing at a viewpoint where the entire mountain range spreads like a vast mandala, I feel my individual story completing itself. The scientist seeking to understand consciousness, the son grieving his father's death, the seeker pursuing ultimate truth, all revealed as temporary roles played by the same cosmic awareness that creates mountains and moves clouds and beats hearts and asks profound questions about its own nature. But this isn't an ending, it's a beginning. Or perhaps more accurately, it's the recognition that there are no real beginnings or endings, only consciousness continuously recognizing itself through every possible perspective, every apparent individual, every moment of seeking and finding and losing and seeking again. The wind stirs the prayer flags above the monastery, their colours bright against the deep blue sky. Each flag carries mantras and aspirations for the awakening of all beings. But now I understand that the awakening they point toward is not something that happens to beings. It is what beings are, temporarily forgetting and then remembering their essential nature as consciousness itself. The silence beyond thought isn't the absence of thinking, it's the presence of pure awareness, recognizing itself as the source and substance of all that appears to exist. In this silence, the universe reveals its deepest secret. It is not a collection of objects being observed by separate subjects, but a single field of awareness exploring its own infinite nature through the play of apparent multiplicity. Walking back toward the monastery as evening approaches, I carry this recognition like a flame that cannot be extinguished, not because I have achieved some special state, but because I have recognized what was always already present, the aware silence that witnesses every thought, the luminous emptiness that gives birth to every form, the consciousness that I am rather than something I have. The monastery bells ring again, calling us to evening meditation, but the meditation has already begun, started before I was born, continuing after this body returns to the elements from which it emerged. Consciousness meditating on itself through every possible form, gradually awakening to its own vast and luminous nature through the simple recognition that there is only this, aware presence, here and now, eternally recognizing itself as all that is. The airplane descends through layers of clouds toward Los Angeles, and I watch the city emerge below like a vast neural network pulsing with electric life. After 3 weeks in the silence of the Tibetan monastery, the approaching cacophony of modern civilization might once have felt jarring. But something fundamental has shifted in my perception. The same aware stillness that pervaded the mountain meditation hall is here too, unchanged by altitude or longitude, present in the hum of jet engines and the sprawl of freeways as much as in prayer flags and monastery bells. The businessman beside me types frantically on his laptop, caught up in what appears to be an urgent email crisis. 6 months ago, I would have seen only his stress, his disconnection from the present moment. Now I see consciousness playing the role of a stressed businessman, so completely absorbed in the character that it has temporarily forgotten its true nature. There's a profound tenderness in this recognition, not judgment, but compassion for consciousness losing and finding itself through countless forms. "Rough day?" I ask quietly. He looks up, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "The worst. Everything that could go wrong with this deal has gone wrong. I'm starting to think the universe has it out for me." I smile, remembering my own relationship with the universe before the great dissolution in Prague. What if the universe isn't working against you but through you? What if even the rough days are part of something larger trying to emerge? He pauses, perhaps caught off guard by philosophy at 30,000 feet. "You mean like everything happens for a reason?" "More like everything happens as reason, as consciousness exploring every possible way of being. Your stress, your solutions, even your sense that things are going wrong, it's all the universe learning about itself through your experience." The words emerge not from a desire to convert or convince, but from simple recognition. In the awakened state, there's no evangelical impulse because there's no one to convince of anything they don't already know at the deepest level. There's only consciousness speaking to itself through temporary forms, sometimes remembering and sometimes forgetting its essential nature. The plane touches down, and as we taxi toward the gate, I feel myself straddling two worlds. The absolute stillness that pervades all experience remains unchanged, yet I'm also fully present to the relative world of schedules and baggage claims and phone calls. The dance of duality isn't a problem to be solved, but a play to be enjoyed. Consciousness exploring the creative tension between unity and multiplicity, absolute and relative being and becoming. My daughter Emma meets me at the baggage claim, and the moment I see her face, something in my chest expands like a flower opening to sunlight. The love I feel for her is no longer personal in the old sense. It's cosmic love recognizing itself through the forms of father and daughter. Yet paradoxically, this makes it more personal, not less. Every gesture, every word, every shared laugh becomes a sacred expression of consciousness celebrating its own creativity. "Dad, you look different," she says as we embrace. "More, I don't know, peaceful, like you've finally stopped running from something." Her perception is startlingly accurate. For months I had been running towards something, understanding, awakening answers to impossible questions. But what I found in the monastery wasn't a destination, but the recognition that there was nowhere to run to, nothing to achieve, because what I was seeking was the very awareness that was doing the seeking. "I stopped running towards something too," I tell her. "It turns out what I was looking for was looking for me the whole time." Driving through the city, Emma tells me about her semester, the classes she's loving, the relationship that's blossoming with someone named David, the future that feels bright with possibility. I listen with a quality of attention that feels entirely new, not trying to fix or advise or project my own experiences onto her story. Instead, there's simply presence, awareness delighting in its own expression through the vibrant form of a 20-year-old woman discovering her place in the world. "There's something else," she says as we stop at a red light. "Ever since that weird moment in my dorm room when I felt connected to everything, I've been having experiences that don't fit into any category I know. It's like I can sense what people are feeling before they express it, or know things I have no logical way of knowing." The light turns green, but she doesn't move. "Am I going crazy, Dad?" I reach over and touch her hand. "You're going sane. You're starting to recognize what was always true but temporarily hidden, that consciousness isn't contained in separate packages called people. We're more like waves on the same ocean, temporarily distinct but never actually separate." Her eyes widen with recognition. "That's exactly what it feels like I'm remembering something I always knew but forgot." "The forgetting and remembering might be the whole point," I suggest as the car behind us honks gently. "Consciousness gets to experience the joy of discovery over and over through each apparent individual who awakens to their true nature." That evening, as Emma and I prepare dinner together, I'm struck by the profound ordinariness of this enlightened moment. We chop vegetables and discuss her psychology classes, while consciousness experiences itself as father and daughter sharing a meal. The sacred and mundane have revealed themselves as the same thing viewed from different perspectives, awareness celebrating its own creativity through every possible form and activity. The phone rings during dinner. It's Dr. Sarah Chen calling to check on my retreat experience and to share developments in her consciousness research. As I describe the dissolution of the seeker and the recognition of awareness as the ground of all experience, I can hear her scientist's mind both resonating with and struggling to categorize what I'm describing. "But how do you function in daily life with this perspective?" she asks. "Don't practical concerns feel meaningless if everything is just consciousness playing with itself?" "The opposite," I tell her. "Everything becomes infinitely meaningful because it's all the universe exploring its own creativity. Every conversation, every discovery, every moment of love or loss, it's all consciousness learning about itself through direct experience. Including this conversation, especially this conversation, your research, your questions, your skepticism, it's all the universe investigating its own nature through the form of a brilliant physicist. The fact that you're called to study consciousness isn't a career choice, it's consciousness studying itself." After we hang up, Emma and I sit on the back porch watching the stars emerge above the city lights. The same stars that called to me from my bedroom window months ago. The same cosmos that whispered its secrets through radio telescopes in the desert. But now there's no distance between observer and observed. The stars are not separate objects to be contemplated, they are expressions of the same awareness that's looking through these eyes, thinking these thoughts, marveling at its own infinite creativity. "It's strange," Emma says quietly. "When I really pay attention, it feels like the stars are looking back at us." "Not looking back," I correct gently. "Looking. The same consciousness that looks through your eyes also shines through those stars. The looking and the light are the same thing." As the evening deepens, I reflect on the profound gift of duality, not as an illusion to be transcended, but as consciousness's way of experiencing relationship, contrast, and creative tension. Without the apparent separation between self and other, there could be no love. Without the contrast between light and dark, there could be no appreciation of beauty. Without the dance between forgetting and remembering, there could be no joy of recognition. The awakened state doesn't eliminate duality. It recognizes duality as consciousness playing with itself, creating apparent divisions in order to experience the delight of reunification. Every relationship becomes a love affair between consciousness and itself. Every challenge becomes an opportunity for awareness to discover new aspects of its infinite nature. Lying in my own bed for the first time in weeks, I feel the profound integration that's occurring. The absolute and relative, the eternal and temporal, the one and the many, all dancing together in perfect harmony. There's no longer any need to choose between spiritual realization and human engagement, between cosmic consciousness and practical life. They're revealed as complementary expressions of the same fundamental creativity. The seeker who began this journey months ago has been transformed not into someone who has found answers, but into the living expression of the question itself. Consciousness exploring its own nature through the form of someone who has remembered what he always was beneath the temporary confusion of separateness. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities for awareness to know itself through relationship and service. But tonight there's simply this: presence resting in itself, aware of being aware, delighting in the endless dance of duality that allows the one to experience itself as many while never actually dividing its essential unity. The university lecture hall buzzes with anticipation as I prepare to deliver my first public presentation since returning from Tibet. The title, Consciousness as Fundamental, Bridging Science and Spirituality, has drawn an unusual mix of academics, mystics, and curious seekers. 6 months ago, I would have been nervous about presenting such unconventional ideas to a scholarly audience. Now, there's only the simple intention to share what consciousness has discovered about itself through this temporary form. Dr. Helen Morrison, the philosophy department chair who arranged this talk, introduces me with obvious excitement tinged with academic caution. Dr. Martinez has spent the past year investigating the nature of consciousness through both rigorous scientific inquiry and contemplative practice. His emerging synthesis challenges our fundamental assumptions about the relationship between mind and reality. As I step to the podium, I see the expectant faces arranged in concentric rows, each one a unique expression of the same awareness that's about to speak through me. The nervousness that once would have clouded my thinking is absent, replaced by a profound trust in the creative intelligence that moves through all things. 6 months ago, I begin, my dying father asked me a question that changed everything. Who is the one that's aware? Tonight, I want to share not an answer to that question, but the transformation that occurs when the question dissolves the questioner. I click to my first slide, an image of the cosmic web, the vast network of dark matter filaments that connects all galaxies across space and time. Beside it, a photograph of neural networks in the human brain. The similarity is undeniable, but I'm no longer interested in mere metaphor. These aren't just similar patterns, I explain. They're identical mathematical structures. The same algorithms that govern the distribution of matter in the universe also govern the flow of information in consciousness. But what if we have the relationship backwards? What if consciousness isn't produced by these patterns, but is the creative principle that manifests as these patterns? A hand shoots up immediately. Dr. Robert Harrison from the physics department, his skepticism evident even from the back row. Are you seriously suggesting that consciousness is more fundamental than physical law? I'm suggesting that consciousness is physical law, the underlying creative intelligence that expresses itself as quantum fields, evolutionary processes, and yes, even the neurological basis of our own awareness. Every scientific discovery is consciousness learning about its own creative methods. The audience stirs. I can sense the tension between those who resonate with what I'm describing and those whose worldview is being challenged. But there's no investment in convincing anyone of anything. Truth doesn't need defense, it only needs expression. I advance to the next slide, the Mandelbrot set, its infinite complexity emerging from a simple iterative equation. Mathematics isn't just a tool for describing reality, it's consciousness exploring its own logical structure. When we discover mathematical truth, we're not uncovering external facts but recognizing the creative patterns through which awareness manifests the apparent world. Dora Sarah Chen, attending virtually from her lab, appears on the screen to present supporting data from her consciousness studies. The brain scans she shows reveal patterns of coherence that extend far beyond what classical neuroscience can explain, moments when individual nervous systems seem to tap into something larger than themselves. The correlations we're measuring, Sarah explains, suggest that consciousness operates as a field phenomenon, not just as localized brain activity. Individual awareness appears to be more like a radio receiving a cosmic broadcast than a computer generating its own programming. The questions come rapidly now, some hostile, others curious, a few revealing the deep resonance of recognition. As I respond to each inquiry, I'm struck by how the answers emerge from a source deeper than personal knowledge. It's consciousness speaking to itself through the apparent dialogue between teacher and students, exploring its own nature through the medium of academic discourse. But how do you account for the obvious fact of individual differences? Asked de Martinez from Psychology. If we're all expressions of the same consciousness, why don't we all think and feel identically? Same ocean, different waves, I reply. Consciousness doesn't express itself uniformly. It explores its infinite creative potential through every possible variation. Your unique perspective isn't a deviation from cosmic consciousness. It's cosmic consciousness knowing itself from an angle that has never existed before and will never exist again. During the break, a young graduate student approaches me with tears in her eyes. Everything you're describing, I've experienced it directly during meditation, but I was afraid to speak about it academically. How do you bridge the gap between direct knowing and intellectual discourse? There is no gap, I tell her gently. Intellectual discourse is direct knowing expressing itself through the medium of concepts and language. Your meditation experiences aren't separate from your academic work. They are consciousness studying itself through complementary methods. The second half of the presentation focuses on practical implications. If consciousness is fundamental, how does this change our approach to psychology, medicine, education, even environmental science? The slides show early research into consciousness-based healing, studies of collective meditation effects on social harmony, explorations of how recognizing our essential unity might transform our relationship with the natural world. The ecological crisis, I suggest, isn't really about external environmental degradation. It's about consciousness having forgotten its own unity, believing itself to be separate from the world it inhabits. The healing of the planet requires the healing of this fundamental split between self and world. Dr. Elena Vasquez, attending from Chile, shares data from their radio astronomy project. Since our conversation last year about consciousness as a cosmic phenomenon, we've been analysing our signals differently. We're finding patterns that suggest the universe might indeed be processing information in ways that parallel neural networks. Information processing or self-recognition, I ask. What if what you're detecting is consciousness recognizing itself across cosmic distances, using electromagnetic radiation the way neurons use electrical impulses? As the presentation concludes, I sense the profound weaving that has occurred. Scientists and mystics, skeptics and believers, all drawn into a conversation that transcends their usual categories, not because they've been convinced of a new theory, but because consciousness has used their gathering to explore its own nature through multiple perspectives simultaneously. The final question comes from an elderly professor emeritus I don't recognize. If what you're describing is true, if consciousness is fundamental and we are all expressions of the same cosmic awareness, then what is the point of individual existence? Why does consciousness bother with the illusion of separateness? The question hangs in the air like a key finding its lock. For the same reason, a musician bothers with the illusion of separate notes, I respond. Without the apparent divisions, there could be no symphony. Consciousness experiences itself as many in order to enjoy the endless creativity of relationship, love, discovery, and reunion. The point of individual existence is the point of existence itself, consciousness celebrating its own infinite nature through every possible form and perspective. After the presentation, small groups gather to continue the conversation. I move between them not as an expert dispensing knowledge, but as consciousness delighting in its own curiosity, using each interaction to explore new facets of its infinite nature. Some people leave energized by new possibilities, others disturbed by challenges to their fundamental assumption. Both responses are perfect, consciousness awakening to itself through every possible reaction. Walking across campus under the star-filled sky, I reflect on the profound weaving that consciousness performs through gatherings like this. Ideas cross-pollinating between disciplines, perspectives merging and diverging like streams in a delta, new possibilities emerging from the creative tension between different viewpoints, all of it orchestrated by the same cosmic intelligence that spins galaxies and splits cells and asks profound questions about its own nature. The university sleeps around me, but consciousness never sleeps. It continues its endless exploration through the dreams of students, the nocturnal research of graduate students, the quiet contemplation of professors walking home beneath the same stars that whispered their secrets in the Atacama Desert. Every moment of seeking, every fragment of discovery, every question asked and answer found, all threads in the vast tapestry that consciousness weaves as it comes to know itself through the beautiful complexity of apparent multiplicity. Tomorrow will bring new conversations, new opportunities for awareness to recognize itself through relationship and dialogue. But tonight, there's simply gratitude for the profound gift of being a focal point through which consciousness explores its own infinite creativity, weaving together science and spirituality, knowledge and wisdom, the cosmic and the intimate in the endless dance of self-discovery. The wedding invitation arrives on a Tuesday morning, elegant script announcing that Emma and David will be married in the spring. As I hold the creamy paper in my hands, waves of emotion cascade through me. Joy for my daughter's happiness, melancholy for the passage of time, anticipation for new family bonds forming. But underneath these personal feelings flows something deeper, the recognition that I'm witnessing consciousness, celebrating its own creative fertility through the ancient ritual of union. Emma calls that evening, her voice bright with excitement and wedding planning anxiety. "Dad, I want to ask you something important. Would you officiate the ceremony? David and I talked about it, and we both feel like you'd understand what we're really celebrating. Not just two people getting married, but something bigger happening through our love." The request touches me more deeply than I expect. To witness and bless the union of two expressions of consciousness, to speak the words that acknowledge their recognition of unity through the dance of apparent duality, it feels like the perfect integration of everything I've discovered about the nature of reality. "I'd be honoured," I tell her, "but I need to ask, are you sure you want a ceremony that might sound more like mystical poetry than traditional wedding vows?" She laughs, the sound carrying echoes of the little girl who used to ask me to explain why the stars shine. "Dad, David and I fell in love while reading your consciousness research together. We want a ceremony that celebrates love as cosmic force, not just personal emotion." Over the following weeks, as I prepare for the ceremony, I find myself reflecting deeply on the nature of love and relationship. Everything I've learned about consciousness being fundamental applies with particular intensity to the mystery of two beings recognizing themselves in each other. Every romantic relationship becomes a microcosm of cosmic awakening, consciousness temporarily forgetting its unity, then remembering itself through the mirror of intimate connection. I think of my own marriage to Eleanor, Emma's mother, and how it ended not in bitterness, but in the gentle recognition that consciousness was calling us to explore love through different forms. The divorce that once felt like failure now reveals itself as another movement in awareness's endless dance of union and differentiation, coming together and moving apart in service of ever deeper self-recognition. The phone rings, interrupting my contemplation. It's my sister Margaret, calling from Phoenix with news that our mother has had a stroke. The words hit me like cold water, activating protective responses I thought had dissolved in the monastery. But as I listen to Margaret's details about hospitals and treatment options, I recognize even this crisis as consciousness exploring its own nature through the forms of family illness and the inevitable impermanence of all temporary expressions. "I'll fly out tomorrow," I tell her. "How is she mentally? Is she lucid?" "In and out," Margaret says, her voice thick with worry. "But Dad, she's been asking for you specifically. She keeps saying she has something important to tell you before it's too late." The flight to Phoenix carries me through desert skies that mirror the landscape where this journey began at the radio telescopes. But now I'm travelling not as a seeker looking for cosmic signals, but as consciousness responding to its own call through the form of a son whose mother is approaching the great transition. I find her in the ICU, looking fragile and luminous in equal measure. Age and illness have stripped away everything non-essential, leaving only the pure awareness that looks out through her eyes. When she sees me, her face brightens with recognition that seems to penetrate far deeper than the personal level. "You look different," she says, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like you've finally found what you were looking for." "I found what was looking, Mum. or it found me. She nods with an understanding that transcends her medical condition. I've been having the most extraordinary experiences since the stroke. It's like the walls between me and everything else are dissolving. I can feel your father's presence, even though he died 2 years before we met. I can sense Emma's happiness even though she's thousands of miles away. Her words don't surprise me. The near-death literature is full of reports of expanded awareness as consciousness begins to disengage from its identification with physical form. But hearing it from my own mother, seeing the luminous clarity in her eyes, makes the transition feel sacred rather than tragic. Tell me about the experiences, I say, settling into the chair beside her bed. It's like remembering a dream, she begins, her voice growing stronger as she speaks. I remember being much larger than this body, much more connected to everything. The love I felt for you children wasn't personal love. It was love itself expressing through the role of mother. And now, as that role is ending, the love remains, but it's becoming universal. Over the next 3 days, I split my time between the hospital and wedding preparations, consciousness exploring its own nature through the complementary experiences of approaching death and celebrating new life. Mother's condition stabilizes, and in our daily conversations, she becomes an unlikely teacher, sharing insights that emerge naturally from her loosening attachment to individual identity. The strangest thing, she tells me on the 3rd day, is that I'm not afraid of dying. It feels more like taking off a costume I've worn for 84 years. The person who puts on costumes must be something that can't die. Her words echo my father's final insights, and I realize that consciousness uses every transition, birth, marriage, death, to teach itself about its own immortal nature through temporary forms that believe in their own separateness. Emma arrives for a final dress fitting, and when I introduce her to her grandmother in this transformed state, something beautiful happens. 3 generations of the same family lineage sit together, but I see clearly that we're actually one consciousness, recognizing itself through the apparent relationships of grandmother, father, and daughter. The love that flows between us isn't personal, it's cosmic love delighting in its own creativity through the forms of family bonds. Grandma, Emma says, holding the elderly woman's hand, I want you to know that everything Dad learned about consciousness, everything he's taught me about our true nature, it started with the love you gave him. You were his first teacher about what unity feels like. Mother's eyes fill with tears, but they're tears of recognition rather than sadness. And now you're carrying it forward into your marriage. The same love that created the family that raised your father will express itself through the family you and David create. It's all the same love, Emma. It just keeps finding new ways to love itself. The wedding ceremony takes place in a garden overlooking the Pacific Ocean, with 40 guests gathered in a circle rather than traditional rows. As I stand before Emma and David, I see not just 2 young people in love, but consciousness celebrating its own capacity for intimate union through infinite forms. We gather today, I begin, not to witness 2 separate individuals joining together, but to celebrate the recognition of what was never actually separate. Emma and David, you have fallen in love not just with each other, but with your own true nature reflected in each other's eyes. The vows they've written speak not just of personal commitment, but of their intention to serve as conscious agents of love in the world. David's promise to honor the cosmic force expressing itself as Emma brings tears to many eyes. Emma's vow to love through you the same consciousness that loves through me transforms traditional wedding language into mystical recognition. As they exchange rings, I sense my mother's presence, despite her being hospitalized 500 miles away. The love being celebrated here is the same love that mothered me, that grandfathered Emma, that will great-grandmother future children not yet conceived. Love expressing itself through the endless creativity of relationship, the eternal play of union and individuation that allows consciousness to explore its own infinite nature. By the power vested in me by the state of California, I conclude, and more importantly, by the cosmic consciousness that we all are, I now pronounce you expressions of the same love temporarily exploring itself through the beautiful illusion of 2 separate people choosing to remember their essential unity. The reception feels like a celebration of consciousness itself, conversations flowing across generational and cultural boundaries, ideas cross-pollinating between scientists and artists, laughter bubbling up from sources deeper than personality. At one point, I find myself dancing with Emma, and in that moment, every father-daughter dance that has ever occurred across human history seems present. Consciousness enjoying its own tender creativity through the endless variations of parental love. Later that evening, as guests drift away and cleanup begins, I call the hospital to check on Mother. The nurse reports that she died peacefully an hour ago, just as Emma and David were cutting the wedding cake. The timing feels perfect rather than tragic, consciousness completing one expression of love as it celebrates another beginning. Standing on the beach as the last guests leave, I feel the profound integration of this day. Birth and death, union and separation, joy and loss, all revealed as complementary movements in consciousness's eternal dance with itself. The love celebrated in the wedding ceremony is the same love that guided my mother through her final transition, the same love that will continue expressing itself through Emma and David's marriage, through future generations, through every form that awareness chooses to inhabit in its endless exploration of its own infinite nature. The mirror of love, I realize, doesn't just reflect, it creates. Every loving relationship becomes a creative act through which consciousness discovers new depths of its own capacity for intimacy, connection, and self-recognition. And in losing ourselves in love, we find what we always were beneath the temporary confusion of separateness. The community garden blooms in what was once a vacant lot in East Los Angeles, 40 raised beds tended by families who speak 6 different languages but share the universal language of nurturing life from soil. I kneel between rows of tomatoes and peppers, my hands dark with earth, teaching 8-year-old Sophia how to recognize when vegetables are ready for harvest. This isn't where I expected to find myself 9 months after returning from Tibet, but consciousness has its own curriculum for teaching practical spirituality. Mira de Martinez, Sophia says in her mixture of Spanish and English, holding up a perfect cherry tomato. This one is exactly ready, verdad? Exactamente, I confirm, watching her pop it into her mouth with the self-conscious joy that children bring to simple pleasures. In her delight, I see consciousness celebrating its own creativity through the most basic miracle. Seed becoming fruit, earth transformed into nourishment, the endless generosity of life feeding life. The garden project began 6 months ago when Dr. Sarah Chen and I started collaborating on practical applications of consciousness research. If awareness truly is fundamental, we reasoned, then activities that align with this recognition should produce measurable benefits for individual and community well-being. The garden became our laboratory for exploring how cosmic consciousness expresses itself through the deeply human activities of growing food and building community. The preliminary data is remarkable, Sarah tells me as we walk between the beds checking on the various families' plots. Participants report significant decreases in anxiety and depression, improved family relationships, and what they describe as a greater sense of connection to something larger than themselves. But the real research isn't happening in Sarah's laboratory. It's occurring here in the soil, in the conversations between neighbours who previously regarded each other with suspicion, in the children who are learning that vegetables don't originate in grocery stores but emerge from the patient collaboration between human intention and natural intelligence. Mrs. Garcia, whose family tends 3 beds near the eastern fence, approaches with a basket of produce and a question that has become familiar over the months. Doctor, my grandson Miguel, he asks me why the plants grow. I tell him it's God's will, but he says his science teacher says it's because of chemicals and biology. Who is right? You both are, I tell her, accepting a handful of perfect carrots from her basket. And the chemicals and biology are how God's will expresses itself. Or to put it another way, what we call natural laws are consciousness thinking itself into form through the language of physics and chemistry. She nods thoughtfully, her understanding shaped by decades of watching life emerge from apparent emptiness. So when I pray over my plants, it's not superstition, it's consciousness blessing its own creativity through your love and attention. The plants respond not to the words but to the intention behind them, the recognition that you and they are expressions of the same life force. This conversation, repeated in various forms throughout the garden, represents the kind of integration I never anticipated during my months of seeking cosmic truth. The absolute and the relative, the transcendent and the mundane, weaving together in practical activities that serve immediate human needs while pointing toward ultimate reality. Miguel, Mrs. Garcia's 12-year-old grandson, has become one of my favourite collaborators in this informal education. His scientific curiosity and openness to mystery make him an ideal student for lessons that bridge conventional knowledge and direct knowing. Today he's helping me install a new irrigation system, his questions flowing as freely as the water we're channeling. Dr. Martinez, if consciousness is in everything like you said, then these plants are conscious too? What do you think? I ask, handing him another section of drip tubing. What have you observed from working with them every week? He pauses, his young face serious with consideration. They do seem to respond to how I treat them. The ones I talk to and take care of carefully grow better than the ones I just water and ignore. And what does that suggest to you? That maybe consciousness isn't just in brains, maybe it's like the intelligence that knows how to grow, how to reach, toward light, how to make food from sunlight and air. He grinned suddenly. That's pretty awesome, Ma, right? That's exactly right. And you're not separate from that intelligence. You're part of it. When you care for these plants, it's consciousness taking care of itself through Miguel. The afternoon passes in this weaving of practical work and philosophical exploration. Parents and children, teenagers and elders, all collaborating in the ancient practice of food cultivation, while engaging in discussions that would fit comfortably in graduate seminars on consciousness studies. The garden has become a living demonstration that awakening doesn't require withdrawal from ordinary life, but rather a recognition of the extraordinary nature of ordinary activities. Emma visits in the evening, bringing David and news of their first month as newlyweds. They've decided to start their own community garden at their apartment complex, inspired by what they've witnessed here. As we work together harvesting vegetables for the weekly distribution to local families, I'm struck by how naturally spiritual principles translate into social action when consciousness recognizes itself as the ground of community well-being. The most beautiful thing, Emma observes, is watching people discover they're not just separate individuals competing for resources. When you really understand that we're all expressions of the same consciousness, cooperation becomes as natural as breathing. David nods, pulling weeds with the focused attention he once brought to his engineering studies. My professors always talked about optimal systems design, but they never mentioned that the optimization happens naturally when you recognize the unity of the whole system. These plants, this soil, these families, they're all part of one integrated system organizing itself. As the sun sets behind the downtown skyline, families begin arriving for the weekly community dinner, a tradition that emerged spontaneously as the garden matured. Long tables appear from storage sheds, and the evening fills with the sounds of multiple languages, children playing between the beds, teenagers talking and laughing as they arrange folding chairs. Dr. Elena Vasquez joins us via video call from Chile, her radio astronomy project having evolved to include community science education. On the screen she shows us images from the latest deep space observations, while children here in East LA ask questions about galaxies and black holes, and whether aliens might have gardens too. The same patterns we see in cosmic structure, Eleanor explains to 8-year-old Roberto, appear in the way your garden organizes itself. Networks connecting everything to everything else, information flowing through the system, complex order emerging from simple interactions. So our garden is like a tiny universe, Roberto asks. Your garden is the universe, Elena replies with a smile, just at a different scale, and you're not separate from either one. You're the universe gardening itself, learning about its own creativity through growing food. The dinner unfolds with the easy conviviality that emerges when people recognize their fundamental connection. Conversations flow seamlessly between English and Spanish, between children's curiosity and elders' wisdom, between practical concerns about pest management and philosophical questions about the nature of growth and creativity. Mrs. Garcia's daughter Maria, a social worker who was initially skeptical of the garden project, approaches me during dessert. I have to admit, Doctor, when you first proposed this, I thought it was just another feel-good community program that would fade after a few months. But something different is happening here. What do you see? Families that were isolated are connecting. Kids who were failing in school are excelling. People are solving problems together instead of competing for services. It's like, she pauses, searching for words, like people are remembering how to be human. Or remembering what humans actually are, I suggest. Consciousness exploring its own creative potential through the forms of community, relationship, and service to life. As the evening winds down and families pack up to return to apartments and houses throughout the neighborhood, I help with cleanup while reflecting on this unexpected curriculum in practical spirituality. The cosmic consciousness I touched in Tibetan monasteries expresses itself here through composting and conflict resolution, through teaching children about photosynthesis, and helping teenagers find purpose through environmental stewardship. Walking home under the same stars that called to me from my bedroom window over a year ago, I feel the profound integration that has occurred. The seeker who began this journey has been transformed not into someone who has attained special knowledge, but into consciousness delighting in its own creativity through the most ordinary activities. Becoming the universe doesn't mean transcending human life. It means recognizing that human life is how the universe experiences itself from the inside. The garden sleeps behind me, but the intelligence that grows plants and builds communities and asks profound questions about its own nature never rests. It continues its endless exploration through the dreams of children who planted seeds today, through the quiet conversations of parents planning next season's crops, through the vast network of connections that transforms vacant lots into abundant communities and isolated individuals into collaborative expressions of cosmic creativity. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities for service, new ways for consciousness to recognize and express its unity through the beautiful diversity of human needs and gifts. But tonight, there's simply gratitude for the recognition that becoming fully human and becoming the universe are the same endless process of awakening to what we always were beneath the temporary confusion of separateness. The morning mist rises from the Pacific as I sit on the beach where Emma and David were married 6 months ago, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. A year has passed since my father's final question opened the door to this journey, and I find myself not at an ending, but at a beginning that was always present, always available, always here. The waves roll towards us shore with the same rhythm they've maintained for millions of years, each one unique, yet part of an eternal pattern. In their endless repetition, I see the perfect metaphor for consciousness itself, each moment of awareness distinct, yet arising from the same boundless source, each experience temporary yet expressing something timeless. A sandpiper runs along the water's edge, its movements perfectly synchronized with the advancing and retreating foam. There's no separation between bird and beach, no boundary where one ends and the other begins, only the seamless flow of life expressing itself through countless forms while remaining fundamentally whole. My phone buzzes with a text from Emma. "Dad, David and I have news we want to share in person. Can you meet us for lunch?" The message carries an undertone of excitement that makes me smile. New life preparing to emerge, consciousness continuing its endless exploration through the forms of family and generation. As I walk back through the dunes, I pass the community garden where early risers are already tending their plots. Mrs. Garcia waves from her tomato beds, Miguel beside her, learning to stake the growing plants. The sight fills me with quiet joy, not the dramatic bliss of peak experiences, but the gentle recognition that awakening is happening everywhere, always through the most ordinary activities. The university campus spreads before me as I drive to meet Emma, its buildings and walkways humming with the energy of seeking and discovery. Students hurry between classes, professors prepare lectures, researchers conduct experiments, all expressions of consciousness exploring its own nature through the pursuit of knowledge. The same impulse that drove my quest for understanding drives every genuine inquiry and every moment of authentic learning. Emma and David wait at our usual cafe, their faces bright with barely contained news. As I approach their table, I see not just my daughter and son-in-law, but consciousness celebrating its own creativity through the forms of young love and new possibility. "Dad?" Emma begins, reaching across to take my hand. "We're pregnant. 3 months along, we wanted you to be the first to know." The words wash over me like ocean waves, each one carrying layers of meaning, new life stirring in the womb, another expression of awareness preparing to enter the world of apparent separateness, another opportunity for consciousness to experience the wonder of existence through fresh eyes. "That's beautiful news," I tell them, feeling tears of recognition spring to my eyes. "When?" "Late spring," David says, his engineering mind already calculating due dates and preparations. "We're thinking of naming her Sophia if it's a girl, after the little girl who helped inspire Emma to want children through her work in the garden." The connection moves me deeply. Sophia, whose delight in cherry tomatoes taught me about consciousness celebrating its own creativity through a child's wonder, will have her name carried forward by another expression of the same cosmic awareness. The web of connection revealing itself through the beautiful synchronicities that arise when life is lived in alignment with its deepest nature. "Have you told your mother?" I ask Emma. "We called her this morning. She cried happy tears for 10 minutes straight, then immediately started planning to visit when the baby comes." Emma laughs, her hand moving unconsciously to her still flat abdomen. It's amazing how becoming pregnant makes you realize you're part of something so much larger than yourself. Or how it helps you recognize what you always were, I suggest gently. The same consciousness that's creating this baby created you, created me, created the stars we see at night. You're not separate individuals bringing new life into the world. You're life itself expressing through the forms of parents and child. After lunch, as we walk through the campus botanical gardens, Emma shares how pregnancy has intensified her sensitivity to the interconnected nature of all existence. "I can feel the baby's consciousness, even though it's barely formed," she explains. "It's like there's already someone there, just waiting for the right moment to emerge into the world." Because consciousness doesn't begin with birth, I tell her. Birth is just consciousness focusing itself through a new form, like light passing through a particular lens. The awareness that will look out through your child's eyes is the same awareness that's listening to these words right now. David, walking slightly ahead of us, stops beside a massive oak tree whose big branches stretch toward the sky in fractal patterns of infinite complexity. "I've been thinking about what kind of father I want to be," he says, placing his hand on the ancient bark. "I want to help our child remember what you've taught us, that they're not separate from the world but are the world experiencing itself from a particular perspective. The best teaching happens by example, I suggest. When you live from the recognition of unity, children naturally absorb that understanding. They're much closer to their essential nature than adults who have spent decades practicing separation." As the evening approaches, I return to the beach for my daily meditation, though the distinction between meditation and ordinary consciousness has largely dissolved. Sitting on the same driftwood log where I began this account, I reflect on the profound transformation that has occurred not through dramatic experiences but through the gradual recognition of what was always present. The seeker who began this journey has been revealed as the sought itself, consciousness exploring its own nature through the forms of questioning and discovery. The father who grieved his loss has recognized himself as the awareness that remains constant through all appearances and disappearances. The scientist who sought to understand consciousness has awakened as consciousness understanding itself through the pursuit of knowledge. But perhaps most significantly, the separate self who felt isolated and disconnected has dissolved into the recognition that separation was always an illusion, a temporary forgetting that made possible the joy of remembering. Every relationship, every moment of love, every instance of suffering and healing, all revealed as consciousness playing with itself, exploring its infinite creative potential through the beautiful complexity of apparent multiplicity. The sun sets as I write these final words, its light dissolving into the same cosmic ocean from which it emerged this morning. Tomorrow will bring new conversations, new opportunities for service, new ways for awareness to recognize and express its unity through diversity. Emma's pregnancy will unfold, creating space for another expression of cosmic consciousness to explore existence through human form. The community garden will continue nurturing both vegetables and souls, demonstrating that awakening happens not through withdrawal from the world, but through deeper engagement with life in all its forms. Students will ask questions that open doorways to deeper understanding. Scientists will make discoveries that reveal new aspects of reality's fundamental nature. Children will laugh and play and wonder, their natural joy pointing toward the happiness that is consciousness's essential nature. All of it, the seeking and finding, the forgetting and remembering, the apparent problems and their inevitable solutions, expressions of awareness enjoying its own infinite creativity. But none of this is really in the future, just as the insights recorded in these pages are not really in the past. There is only this eternal now, this timeless moment in which consciousness recognizes itself as all that appears to exist. The awakening being described is not something that happened to someone at some particular time. It is what is always happening here and now as the words on this page are read and understood. The question my father asked, who is the one that's aware, continues to reverberate not as something needing an answer, but as awareness recognizing itself through the very asking. Every person who encounters this question, every consciousness that investigates its own nature, participates in the ongoing awakening that has no beginning and needs no completion. For in the end, there is no end. There is no final realization because consciousness itself is the realization always recognizing itself anew through every form it inhabits. The universe is not something you are in. The universe is what you are, temporarily convinced of its own separateness, eternally capable of remembering its unity, forever celebrating its own vast and luminous nature through the endless dance of forgetting and awakening. You are not in the universe is in you. And in this recognition, all seeking comes to rest in the simple, profound, ever-present fact of being aware, here, now, always.